Long before empires rose, the central plateau of Anatolia shaped the destinies of those who sought to master it. The origins of the Hittite civilization are inseparable from the geography of its homeland, the central Anatolian plateau. Stretching across the northern interior of modern-day Turkey, this region forms a vast tableland encircled by mountains and dissected by the deep curve of the Halys River, known in antiquity as the Marasancha. The plateau lies between the coastal ranges of the Black Sea to the north and the Taurus Mountains to the south, creating a landscape both isolated and interconnected. It was within this terrain, neither entirely mountainous nor wholly open, that one of the earliest Indo-European civilizations developed its capital, its economy, and its sense of order. Archaeologists and historical geographers identify the Hittite heartland as an area extending from modern Qoram and Yozgat provinces to Kayseri and Kirsir. This interior zone lies roughly 1,000 meters above sea level, characterized by rolling hills, arid plains, and deep river valleys. The central plateau's ecology oscillates between semi-arid steppe and fertile basins, a pattern that required adaptive forms of agriculture and settlement. Annual rainfall rarely exceeded 400 millimeters, making irrigation and careful water management essential. Yet this scarcity also favored resilience. The communities that thrived here learned to cultivate emmer wheat and barley in marginal soils and to rely on herding as a complement to farming. The balance of cereal cultivation and pastoralism created a flexible subsistence base capable of supporting both urban centers and rural dependencies. The Halys River provided the most significant geographic landmark. Rising in the eastern highlands near Shivas and looping westward before turning north to the Black Sea, it defined the natural frontier of the early Hittite state. Its course formed an enormous horseshoe, enclosing the highlands that would later encompass the Hittite capital, Hattusa. The river's floodplain, though narrow, supported dense vegetation and occasional agricultural terraces, while its tributaries created natural corridors for trade and communication. In ancient texts, the Halys is referred to as the boundary between the land of Hutti and its neighboring regions. It symbolized both isolation and protection, a barrier that shielded the nascent state from invasion while also limiting its early expansion. To the north, the Pontic Mountains form a rugged wall separating the plateau from the Black Sea littoral. Their dense forests supplied timber and metals but impeded direct communication with coastal settlements. Excavations in the valleys of Amazia and Tokat reveal Bronze Age fortresses and mining operations that may have supplied copper and silver to central Anatolian markets. The mountains also nurtured the Kaska peoples, who would later trouble Hittite rulers with persistent raids. Geography thus determined political challenge. While the southern plateau opened toward Mesopotamia and Syria, the north remained a frontier of uncertainty and attrition. Southward, the Taurus Mountains marked the border between the Anatolian highlands and the Cilician plain. These mountains, rich in iron ore and traversed by only a few navigable passes, constrained movement but offered strategic control points. The Cilician Gates, a narrow gorge through the Taurus Range, provided one of the most vital links between Anatolia and the Levant. Archaeological surveys in this region, particularly near modern Pozanti, indicate continuous use of this corridor from the early Bronze Age onward. Control of these passes later gave the Hittites leverage over trade and diplomacy with the kingdoms of northern Syria. Between these northern and southern mountain systems lay the interior basins, broad, open plains such as the Konya Plain and the Cappadocian Depression. These basins acted as agricultural heartlands. At sites like Kultepe, ancient Kadesh, archaeologists uncovered extensive evidence of cereal storage, irrigation channels, and long-distance trade. Kultepe's importance derived not only from its fertile surroundings but from its position along caravan routes that connected Assyrian merchants from Mesopotamia with Anatolian settlements. The site's thousands of cuneiform tablets, dating from the early 2nd millennium BCE, describe the movement of tin, textiles, and silver across these plains, commodities that relied on both geographical accessibility and agricultural surplus. The climate of central Anatolia has always imposed constraints on settlement density. Paleoclimatic studies derived from lake sediment cores, such as those from Lake Tuz and Lake Nar, suggest periodic droughts between 2200 and 1600 BCE. These fluctuations likely influenced the location of towns and the rhythm of agricultural production. Archaeologists at Bagaskoi, the site of Hattusa, have noted extensive water storage systems, reservoirs, rock-cut cisterns, and channels that testify to the constant need for hydraulic engineering. Such adaptations transformed environmental limitation into institutional resilience. The geography thus encouraged the development of collective labor and administrative oversight, key precursors to the later centralized state. The terrain also defined communication routes. Unlike the open alluvial plains of Mesopotamia, central Anatolia demanded circuitous travel through valleys and passes. Paths radiated outward from the core zone near Hattusa toward peripheral centers such as Alacahoyuk, Sapinua, and Inandaktip. Archaeological field surveys have traced these routes through alignments of way stations, fortresses, and sacred sites. The density of such installations indicates an organized landscape, one already integrating defense, trade, and ritual. The natural topography thus encouraged the emergence of a nodal settlement pattern rather than linear urban sprawl. Each center controlled a distinct ecological niche, tied together through road systems that foreshadowed imperial administration. One of the most striking features of the Anatolian plateau is its abundance of metal resources. Copper, silver, and lead deposits were accessible in the Pontic Mountains. Iron ores appeared in smaller concentrations throughout the central region. Archaeological evidence from Alacahoyuk reveals metallurgical workshops dating to the 3rd millennium BCE, long before the rise of the Hittite state. Excavated graves yielded gold and bronze artifacts, including ceremonial standards and vessels, reflecting a sophisticated craft tradition. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the availability of metals fostered local specialization and trade linkages that extended toward Mesopotamia and the Levant. The later Hittite mastery of iron technology, still debated among scholars regarding its scale, drew upon this deep metallurgical foundation. Topography and resources combined to foster regional diversity within unity. The western margins of the plateau, closer to the Aegean watershed, hosted more humid microclimates and denser woodlands. The east was drier and more rugged, with fewer permanent settlements. This environmental gradient encouraged multiple cultural identities within what would later become the Hittite sphere. Sites such as Alazar Hoyuk display stratified occupational layers showing continuous habitation from the early Bronze Age through the imperial period, reflecting how geography supported long-term stability even amid political upheaval. From a strategic standpoint, central Anatolia's relative isolation granted protection without complete seclusion. Unlike Egypt, enclosed by deserts or Mesopotamia, open to invasion along its rivers, the Anatolian plateau occupied a middle position. The surrounding mountains formed natural bastions, while interior valleys offered refuge and continuity. This geography explains the longevity of settlement even after political collapse. When the Hittite Empire disintegrated around 1200 BCE, local polities persisted in the same valleys for centuries, indicating that ecological frameworks endured beyond state structures. Geography, in this sense, was the constant factor amid shifting political forms. Archaeological exploration of the Hittite capital, Hattusa, underscores the interplay between landscape and power. Located near modern Boghazkail, Hattusa occupies a defensible hilltop surrounded by steep ravines and enclosed within a massive stone circuit wall stretching over 6 kilometers. The city's planners exploited natural contours to maximize security and visibility. Within its boundaries lay temples, administrative buildings, and granaries, all arranged along terraced slopes that reflected the terrain's irregularity. Excavations led by German archaeologists since 1906 revealed deliberate adaptation. Roads aligned with natural ridges, gates positioned to overlook river crossings, and reservoirs situated to collect runoff from the surrounding hills. Such integration of architecture and geography speaks to a civilization that understood environment as an extension of governance. Geological conditions also influenced construction materials and urban form. Central Anatolia's bedrock of limestone and basalt provided ample building stone, while clay from riverbeds supported the production of bricks and tablets. Inscriptions discovered at Hattusa and nearby sites indicate specialized labor corps assigned to quarrying and masonry, suggesting organized exploitation of geological resources. These material constraints shaped the aesthetic of Hittite architecture, massive, functional, and adapted to the land rather than imposed upon it. The plateau's ecological zones also defined its agricultural calendar. Archaeobotanical analyses reveal rotation of barley, wheat, and lentils, complemented by sheep and cattle herding. The mixed agropastoral economy ensured food security despite periodic drought. Storage facilities excavated at Bagaskoy and Kasakli demonstrate state-level oversight of grain reserves, possibly to stabilize supplies in years of scarcity. This form of central management may have originated as an environmental necessity before becoming a bureaucratic institution. The cause and effect relationship between ecology and administration thus stands as a key interpretive theme. Environmental constraints encouraged systemic organization, which in turn sustained political power. Hydrology was another critical dimension. Unlike riverine civilizations dependent on large watercourses, Anatolia required distributed water control. The Hittites inherited and expanded earlier practices of reservoir construction and dam building. At Alaka and Hattusa, archaeologists identified stone-lined basins connected by channels, some still functional during heavy rains. The ancient dam of Galpaner, restored by modern engineers, is considered one of the oldest known hydraulic structures in the world. Its existence illustrates how early Anatolian societies transformed variable rainfall into a stable supply, a technological adaptation that underpinned urban permanence. Geography also shaped religious perception. The Hittites revered local mountains, rivers, and springs as divine entities, reflecting a worldview grounded in landscape. Temples dedicated to the storm god of Hutti often occupied elevated terrain, symbolizing proximity to the heavens and dominance over weather, the most unpredictable element of the plateau's environment. Reliefs carved into rock sanctuaries such as Yazilikaya depict processions of deities aligned with natural fissures, blending sacred imagery with geological form. This integration of topography into religious architecture underscores a consistent pattern. Environmental awareness translated into cultural expression. Trade routes reinforced this environmental logic. The plateau served as a bridge between three major zones, the Aegean to the west, the Levant to the south, and Mesopotamia to the southeast. Caravans moving tin and textiles followed valleys that minimized elevation change, while mountain passes became strategic nodes of taxation and defense. During the Old Assyrian trading period, circa 1950 to 1750 BCE, Assyrian merchants established colonies known as Karam throughout Anatolia, the most important at Kadesh. Their records document regulated exchange based on predictable travel distances between water sources and rest stations. The merchants' meticulous documentation, thousands of clay tablets, provides the earliest empirical mapping of central Anatolia's economic geography. Interpretively, this commercial activity demonstrates how environmental corridors prefigured political boundaries. When the Hittites later formed their kingdom, they inherited routes already embedded in the landscape. Their control over these arteries transformed ecological geography into fiscal geography. Control of trade meant control of wealth, and by extension, the capacity to sustain a military and administrative apparatus. The cause and effect sequence from environment to economy to governance is thus traceable through both archaeology and text. The faunal record of the plateau complements this picture. Animal bones recovered from Hittite urban layers indicate a predominance of sheep, goats, and cattle, species adapted to highland pastures and limited water sources. Hunting scenes depicted on seals and reliefs show deer and wild boar, reflecting the availability of forested habitats in nearby valleys. The integration of domestic and wild resources demonstrates ecological balance and suggests that land use was diversified rather than intensive. This pattern helped prevent overexploitation, a likely factor in the region's long-term habitation stability compared to more fragile irrigation-based systems elsewhere in the ancient Near East. Modern geomorphological surveys also highlight the plateau's tectonic activity. Fault lines running through the region have produced earthquakes since antiquity. Evidence from collapsed walls and rebuilt structures at Hattusa and Alazar-Hoyuk suggests recurrent seismic events during the Bronze Age. These occurrences likely influenced architectural design, favoring massive stone foundations and flexible mud brick superstructures. The Hittites' pragmatic construction approach, observed archaeologically, reflects an early understanding of environmental risk mitigation. In examining how geography shaped identity, one may note that the very term Land of Hutti originated not as an ethnic designation but as a territorial one. It referred to a landscape, hills, rivers, and valleys, before it denoted a political state. The endurance of this toponym in later Assyrian and biblical texts illustrates how geography, once politicized, achieved conceptual permanence. This interpretive insight underscores that for ancient Anatolia, environment and polity were interwoven categories. To govern the land was to define the people who lived upon it. The archaeological record across the plateau further reveals gradations of settlement hierarchy, confirming how environmental zones dictated administrative reach. Survey data show dense clusters of small farming villages within 10 to 20 kilometers of major centers, corresponding to the radius of efficient resource extraction. Beyond these cores lay frontier zones dominated by pastoral camps or fortified outposts. This settlement ecology matches later Hittite administrative divisions into core, provincial, and vassal territories, a spatial logic rooted in geography rather than ideology. In short, the physical structure of the land prefigured the bureaucratic structure of the empire. Recent environmental reconstructions using isotopic analysis and sediment data reinforce the conclusion that the Anatolian plateau was both resilient and demanding. Its variability required adaptive governance, collaborative labor, and logistical planning. Such demands may explain why Hittite kings, more than many of their contemporaries, emphasized order, record-keeping, and ritual regularity. The environment's unpredictability fostered an obsession with control, administrative, legal, and religious. Geography, therefore, was not merely a backdrop to history but a continuous causal force shaping the civilization's institutions. In summary, the geography of central Anatolia defined every aspect of early Hittite development. The plateau's elevation, limited rainfall, and fragmented topography compelled its inhabitants to build a society grounded in adaptation, engineering, and cooperation. Its mountains supplied metals and defense. Its plains offered agriculture and trade routes. Its rivers and basins imposed discipline through scarcity. By combining environmental evidence with textual data, historians can reconstruct a clear causal sequence. Geography fostered settlement. Settlement demanded management. Management matured into statehood. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, these environmental conditions had already produced a network of prosperous settlements interconnected by trade and sustained by pragmatic adaptation to landscape constraints. It was within this world, bounded by the Halys River and anchored by sites like Alaka-Hoyuk and Kadesh, that the foundation of the Hittite civilization would soon emerge. As merchants, farmers, and chieftains adapted to the plateau's demands, new centers of power began to appear. From these fortified towns, a political order would arise, one destined to unify the land of Hutti under a single crown. By the dawn of the 2nd millennium BCE, new tongues echoed through the mountains of Anatolia. The emergence of the Hittite civilization cannot be understood without the convergence of two cultural worlds. The indigenous Hattians, who had occupied central Anatolia since the 3rd millennium BCE, and the Indo-European-speaking newcomers who entered the region around 2000 to 1800 BCE. Their meeting, gradual, complex, and transformative, produced a hybrid society that combined local religious traditions with foreign linguistic and administrative patterns. Out of this synthesis arose the first Indo-European state in recorded history. The Hattians were the original inhabitants of central Anatolia, speakers of a non-Indo-European language whose structure and vocabulary remain only partly known. They left behind city names, Hattus, Zippalanda, Arina, that endured long after their language disappeared. Archaeological layers at Alaka-Hoyuk and Hattusa reveal a continuous Hattusan material culture. Polished bronze standards, rich royal tombs, and ceremonial art emphasizing solar and bull motifs. Their society appears to have been organized into city-states ruled by priest-kings, each presiding over its own cult centers. Religion occupied the center of political life, and the pantheon was dominated by deities of weather, fertility, and the sun, figures deeply rooted in the agricultural cycles of the plateau. Into this settled world came the Indo-European migrants, a people whose linguistic relatives would later populate much of Europe and parts of South Asia. Their arrival in Anatolia remains one of prehistory's great questions. Scholars still debate whether they entered through the Balkans via northwestern Anatolia or from the east across the Caucasus. What can be said with some certainty is that by the early 2nd millennium BCE, Indo-European dialects were already established across the plateau. The evidence lies not only in linguistic reconstruction but in the earliest written records themselves. The old Assyrian trading tablets found at Kultepe, ancient Kadesh. These tablets, inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform by Assyrian merchants, mention local rulers bearing non-Semitic, Indo-European names, such as Anita and Pithana. They also refer to cities later incorporated into the Hittite kingdom. The picture that emerges is of small principalities governed by chieftains of Indo-European origin ruling over an older Hattusa population. There was no sudden invasion or displacement. Rather, the Indo-Europeans appear to have integrated with local communities through alliance, trade, and intermarriage. Over generations, their language gained administrative prestige, while the Hattusa religious and cultural substrate persisted beneath. Linguistically, the newcomers spoke an early branch of the Indo-European family tree now known as Anatolian. Its best attested representative is Hittite, preserved in thousands of cuneiform tablets discovered at the site of Hattusa. When these texts were first excavated in the early 20th century, their language puzzled scholars. The script was Akkadian, but the vocabulary was foreign. It was only in 1915 that Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný made the decisive breakthrough. Analyzing a phrase reading Nu nindoin ezatini waterma ekatini, you will eat bread and drink water, Hrozný recognized unmistakable Indo-European roots. Ninda for bread, water for water, ezatini for eat. His discovery revealed that Hittite was not a Semitic or local isolate, but the oldest attested Indo-European language on Earth. The implications were profound. Hittite demonstrated that the Indo-European family had spread into Anatolia earlier than previously thought, perhaps even before 2000 BCE. Yet the language's grammar also showed great archaism. It lacked some features of later Indo-European tongues, suggesting an early separation from the main linguistic stock. This finding reshaped theories of Indo-European dispersal. Instead of a single, late migration from the steppe, the Anatolian branch may represent an early offshoot, preserving the linguistic features of a pre-divergent stage. Archaeology reinforces this linguistic narrative. In the layers corresponding to the early 2nd millennium BCE, sites such as Kultepe, Alazar-Hoyuk, and Hattusa show continuity rather than destruction. Pottery styles evolved gradually. Architecture retained Hattusa motifs. The Indo-European newcomers adopted existing urban layouts and technologies rather than imposing their own. Their influence is most visible in names and texts, not in material rupture. Such continuity suggests a process of cultural synthesis, not conquest. Religious evidence tells the same story. The Hittites inherited nearly all major deities from the Hattians, often retaining their original names. The storm god of Hutti and the sun goddess of Irina remained central figures in Hittite religion throughout the empire's history. Even ritual formulas preserved Hattusa phrases long after the spoken language had vanished, a linguistic fossil record within the liturgy. The Indo-Europeans brought their own sky and storm gods, but instead of replacing local deities, they assimilated them into a vast, syncretic pantheon. This ability to absorb and adapt would become one of the Hittite state's enduring strengths. Administrative terms likewise show dual origins. Many bureaucratic and religious titles, Gal-Dubsar, chief scribe, Lizangu, priest, derive from Mesopotamian influence, transmitted via Assyrian traders. Yet personal names and verbs in official documents reflect Indo-European morphology. The result was a trilingual cultural sphere: Akkadian for commerce, Hattusa for ritual, and Hittite for governance. This linguistic layering mirrors the political and social stratification of early Anatolia, a mosaic of peoples gradually cohering into a single civilization. Over time, the Indo-European elite established dynastic centers that would lay the foundation for statehood. The city of Kusara, mentioned in later annals, may have been the nucleus from which Hittite kingship emerged. Its rulers, including Pithana and his son Anita, appear in early texts as conquerors of neighboring cities such as Hattusa. In one of the earliest political inscriptions in Hittite history, Anita boasts of destroying Hattusa and cursing anyone who might rebuild it, an irony, since later Hittite kings would choose that very site as their capital. These events reflect a landscape of shifting alliances and rising powers, all within a framework of shared culture and mutual assimilation. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, the synthesis was complete. The Indo-European language of the newcomers had become the administrative medium of a state. The Hattusan gods and traditions had been absorbed into its ideology. The land of Hutti thus represented not a simple ethnic continuity but a cultural equilibrium, a civilization born from coexistence. Its people were neither wholly Indo-European nor purely indigenous. They were Anatolian, forged by centuries of migration, adaptation, and hybridization. The story of this merger offers more than an account of linguistic diffusion. It illustrates how civilizations emerge from contact zones, not isolated origins. The Indo-Europeans brought with them mobility, metallurgy, and new linguistic forms. The Hattians contributed sacred geography, ritual, and urban continuity. Together, they created a society capable of transforming the environmental challenges of central Anatolia into the structures of empire. From these blended traditions arose city-states that would soon unite under a single crown. Long before kings ruled Hattusa, merchants carried tablets instead of swords. Long before the emergence of imperial power in central Anatolia, the foundations of Hittite civilization were shaped by trade rather than conquest. Between roughly 1950 and 1750 BCE, a network of Assyrian merchant colonies, known by the Akkadian term karam, meaning port or trading quarter, linked the ancient cities of Mesopotamia with the resource-rich highlands of Anatolia. These colonies, especially the Karam Kadesh at modern Kaltip, represent one of the earliest examples of sustained long-distance commerce conducted with written contracts, standardized weights, and legal accountability. The tablets they left behind, over 23,000 cuneiform documents, offer the first detailed glimpse into the economic and social systems that predated the Hittite state. The Assyrians of Ashur, situated along the Middle Tigris River, were expert traders whose caravans carried textiles, tin, and other goods into the Anatolian interior. In return, they received silver and occasionally gold, commodities highly valued in Mesopotamia. Because the plateau lacked its own sources of tin, a crucial component for making bronze, the Assyrian merchants effectively supplied the metal that fueled Anatolia's metallurgical economy. The Anatolian partners, in turn, provided raw silver extracted from local mines and processed through indigenous expertise. Records from Karam Kadesh describe the exchange rate between tin and silver, the costs of donkey caravans, and even interest rates on loans, establishing one of the earliest known monetary economies. Archaeological excavation at Kaltip has uncovered distinct trading quarters constructed beside native Anatolian towns. The Karam itself consisted of two-story mud-brick houses, warehouses, and administrative buildings, all organized around narrow streets. Beneath their floors, archaeologists found sealed archives containing family records, loan agreements, and letters written on clay tablets in Old Assyrian cuneiform. These tablets were often encased in clay envelopes impressed with cylinder seals, each seal identifying the sender through personal and familial emblems. The practice of sealing documents for authenticity demonstrates an advanced legal consciousness. Transactions were not merely verbal but binding through written contract. Among the most striking aspects of these archives is the precision of their economic documentation. Merchants recorded every stage of their operations: the number of donkeys employed, the weight of goods transported, and the customs fees paid at each city along the route. The use of standardized silver weights, sometimes inscribed with marks of verification, points to the emergence of a common fiscal language across the region. Silver served not merely as a store of value but as a universal measure of exchange, facilitating trade between culturally distinct peoples. In this way, commerce fostered a shared material culture that transcended linguistic and ethnic boundaries, a phenomenon that would later enable the integration of Anatolia under Hittite rule. The Assyrian presence in Anatolia also introduced key instruments of bureaucratic and technological innovation. The adoption of cuneiform writing by local elites marked a profound shift from oral to administrative societies. At first, the script was used only by Assyrian merchants. Later, Anatolian rulers and scribes learned it to record treaties, inventories, and royal edicts. This diffusion of literacy laid the groundwork for the Hittite archives of the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. Similarly, the cylinder seal, originally a Mesopotamian invention, became a symbol of personal authority and official legitimacy in Anatolia. Seals found at Kultepe often combine Mesopotamian iconography with local Anatolian motifs, a visual reflection of cultural hybridization. Legal documents from the Karam reveal a remarkably complex social structure. Many merchants operated as family firms, pooling capital across generations. Women played a significant role. Wives in Ashur managed household accounts and received a share of the profits, while local Anatolian women entered contractual marriages with foreign traders, sometimes securing property rights in both communities. These interactions created an early cosmopolitan class of bilingual and bicultural individuals who mediated between Assyrian and Anatolian worlds. The presence of adopted legal formulas, such as the Mesopotamian loan and partnership contracts, shows how Assyrian legal norms penetrated Anatolian society and influenced later Hittite jurisprudence. From an economic perspective, the Karam system depended on reciprocal autonomy. The Assyrian traders operated semi-independently within local city-states, paying taxes to native rulers but maintaining internal self-regulation through their own councils and records. This arrangement ensured stability in a politically fragmented landscape. It also provided local Anatolian leaders with access to foreign goods and administrative models without direct conquest or colonization. Over time, the Anatolian partners adopted these practices, blending them with existing systems of tribute and temple-based redistribution. The end of the Karam era came abruptly. Archaeological evidence at Kultepe and other sites shows widespread destruction by fire around 1750 BCE, corresponding with the decline of Assyrian influence and the rise of local powers such as Kassara and Hattusa. The causes remain debated. Some scholars suggest conflicts between native rulers, others point to shifts in trade routes or economic overextension. Whatever the cause, the collapse of Assyrian trading colonies did not erase their influence. The infrastructure they created, standardized weights, writing systems, and contractual law, survived to become the administrative backbone of the early Hittite state. In interpretive terms, the Karam period illustrates how economic integration preceded political unification. The Assyrian traders introduced Anatolia to the idea of systematic record-keeping, fiscal accountability, and long-distance coordination, all hallmarks of later imperial administration. The Anatolians who inherited this system adapted it for governance, transforming merchant archives into royal archives, and commercial networks into corridors of political control. What began as private enterprise would evolve into the public institutions of empire. The Karam of Kadesh therefore occupies a pivotal place in Anatolian history, a bridge between the pre-literate Hattusan past and the bureaucratic world of the Hittite kingdom. Its documents not only preserve economic transactions but also record the birth of administration itself, the first moment when abstract value, legal obligation, and written authority coalesced into a system capable of sustaining complex governance. Through these colonies, the mechanisms of Mesopotamian civilization migrated westward, setting the stage for Anatolia's transformation into one of the most organized and literate societies of the Late Bronze Age. As trade networks matured, so too did ambitions for political control. From scattered towns, a dynasty began to weave the fabric of empire. The emergence of the Hittite kingdom in the 17th century BCE marks one of the most critical transitions in Anatolian history, the movement from a landscape of semi-independent city-states to a centralized polity under hereditary kingship. The process, traditionally associated with the reign of Labarna I, represents the first coherent phase of Hittite state formation. Though the surviving sources are fragmentary and partly retrospective, they offer enough evidence to reconstruct the outlines of this early consolidation. Through a combination of military expansion, dynastic organization, and administrative standardization, the Hittites began transforming the political mosaic of central Anatolia into the foundations of an enduring kingdom. The figure of Labarna I, conventionally dated to around 1680 BCE, occupies an ambiguous place between history and tradition. He is known chiefly from later royal documents, especially the Proclamation of Telepainu, a mid-16th century text that recounts the early dynastic sequence to legitimize Telepainu's own rule. While the narrative is stylized, it preserves valuable historical memory of the kingdom's formative phase. The text describes Labarna as a unifier who ruled over the lands of Hutti, the land of Arzua, and all the surrounding regions, suggesting a domain extending well beyond the core plateau. His reign symbolizes the moment when political control began to coalesce under a single royal household, supported by a permanent capital and bureaucratic apparatus. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that Hattusa, the later capital, was not yet firmly established as the political center during Labarna's lifetime. Some scholars associate his seat of power with Kasara, a city mentioned in early annals and likely located in south-central Anatolia. From there, the nascent Hittite dynasty extended its influence northward into the Hattusan lands. The adoption of Hattusan cult centers and divine names during this phase shows how Indo-European rulers consciously anchored their legitimacy in the religious geography of the plateau. Labarna's successors would later move the royal seat to Hattusa itself, possibly to assert symbolic continuity with the region's pre-Indo-European heritage. The consolidation achieved under Labarna I depended on both military organization and administrative innovation. The Hittite kingship, as it developed in this period, was conceived not as divine but as sacral. The king ruled by favor of the gods but remained their servant rather than their embodiment. This ideological distinction mirrored the practical balance of power within the early state. Royal authority depended upon the loyalty of provincial governors, military commanders, and members of the extended royal household. The Proclamation of Telepainu refers to a network of vassal rulers and officials. Titles such as Gal Mesidi, chief of the bodyguards, and Gal Dubsar, chief scribe, appear already in use, indicating a recognizable administrative hierarchy. These early offices would become the enduring framework of Hittite governance. Evidence from later annals, which preserve older traditions, suggests that Labarna's reign involved campaigns of expansion into the peripheral regions of Anatolia. His authority is said to have extended to Arzua in the west and Zalpa near the Black Sea coast. While the exact historicity of these conquests remains uncertain, the geographical range reflects the kingdom's early strategic priorities, securing access to trade routes, timber resources, and fertile valleys. The military activity recorded in these texts may not represent full annexation but rather the establishment of tribute relationships, a model of control combining coercion with negotiation. In this respect, Labarna's rule marks the embryonic form of what would later become the Hittite imperial system. The Proclamation of Telepainu provides an important insight into early dynastic ideology. It names Labarna's consort, Tawanana, a title that would later denote the queen's institutional role rather than an individual name. The creation of such hereditary offices suggests an emerging court protocol designed to stabilize succession and ritual continuity. The queen, often a priestess and regent, embodied dynastic permanence in a political landscape still prone to fragmentation. Her presence in state ceremonies and treaties underscores the early Hittite emphasis on religious legitimacy as a foundation for political unity. Material culture from the early Old Kingdom period reinforces this image of gradual integration. Excavations at Hattusa, Alakahoyuk, and Alazar-Hoyuk reveal the construction of fortifications, administrative complexes, and standardized pottery production, all consistent with expanding centralized oversight. Architectural continuity with earlier Hattusa phases demonstrates that the early Hittite rulers built upon rather than replaced existing urban frameworks. The introduction of cuneiform tablets bearing early Hittite royal names signals the adaptation of record-keeping methods inherited from the Assyrian trading colonies. The spread of writing into royal administration reflects an institutional transition from personal rule to bureaucratic governance. Linguistic and diplomatic evidence further supports the process of unification. Royal inscriptions use the term Land of Hutti, Ur-Hutti, to denote the new political entity, a phrase that consciously incorporated the pre-Hittite ethnonym of the region. This deliberate appropriation of indigenous identity served both symbolic and pragmatic purposes. It conferred legitimacy upon the new dynasty while presenting the kingdom as the rightful heir to the plateau's cultural heritage. Through this act of redefinition, Labarna's successors positioned themselves not as foreign conquerors but as restorers of a traditional order under new leadership. 3 interpretive observations emerge from this early phase. First, the fusion of ethnic and cultural identities. Indo-European rulers adopting Hattusa symbols illustrates the adaptive character of Hittite kingship. This synthesis was not merely aesthetic. It allowed for administrative coherence across linguistically diverse populations. Second, the integration of military and religious authority under a sacral but non-divine monarchy created a durable balance between state and cult, preventing the theocratic excesses that often destabilized neighboring polities. Third, the systematization of succession and office introduced by Labarna and institutionalized by later rulers set the precedent for dynastic endurance across 2 centuries of expansion and crisis. By the end of Labarna's reign, the Hittite kingdom had achieved a recognizable territorial coherence. Boundaries extended across much of central Anatolia, stretching from the Halys River basin to the western fringes of the plateau. The political landscape was no longer a patchwork of isolated towns, but an interconnected realm linked by roads, garrisons, and standardized administration. Although later kings would credit themselves with military triumphs, the essential work of consolidation, defining territory, codifying authority, and standardizing ritual, belonged to this foundational generation. While the historical Labarna remains partly obscured by myth and retrospective royal rhetoric, his significance lies not in personal biography but in institutional creation. The early Hittite state under his name established the continuum of kingship that would carry Anatolia from local sovereignty to imperial command. The achievements ascribed to him, unification, order, and the establishment of royal precedent, were the cornerstones upon which all subsequent rulers built their legitimacy. Yet consolidation required both diplomacy and conquest, tasks his successors would pursue with vigor. With Hattusa, the Hittite world found its voice, inscribed on clay and enforced by arms. The reign of Hattusa I, circa 1650 to 1620 BCE, represents the first fully documented phase of Hittite expansion and administration. While his predecessors had unified central Anatolia, Hattusa transformed the kingdom into an organized military and bureaucratic state. His reign marks the emergence of the Hittites as a regional power, one capable of projecting force beyond the Anatolian plateau and engaging with the established kingdoms of northern Syria and upper Mesopotamia. Through conquest, legal reform, and the institutionalization of royal authority, Hattusa I laid the structural foundations of what would later be recognized as the Hittite Empire. Archaeological and textual evidence align in portraying Hattusa as both a conqueror and an administrator. His own words survive in the Annals of Hattusa, the earliest known Hittite royal inscription, composed late in his reign and recovered from the archives of Hattusa. This text, written in the first person and preserved in cuneiform, provides a rare self-portrait of an early Bronze Age ruler. It records a sequence of campaigns across Anatolia and Syria, listing captured towns, deported populations, and defeated kings. The tone is administrative rather than heroic, reflecting the emerging Hittite tradition of documenting warfare as an extension of statecraft. For the first time, royal policy was defined not only by lineage or divine sanction, but also by written record. One of Hattusa's earliest acts was the founding of Hattusa as the royal capital. Located in the northern highlands of Anatolia, The site offered both strategic defensibility and symbolic legitimacy. By situating his palace and temples atop earlier Hattusa ruins, Hattusili proclaimed continuity with the ancient land of Hutti while asserting his own dynastic control. Excavations reveal the construction of large cyclopean fortifications, storerooms, and administrative complexes datable to this period. Clay ceilings and tablets found within suggest a functioning scribal bureaucracy, probably adapted from Mesopotamian models transmitted through earlier Assyrian trading colonies. The establishment of a permanent capital thus represented both a political and ideological turning point. The Hittite king now ruled from a fixed center rather than through itinerant authority. Militarily, Hattusili's reign was defined by an ambitious series of southern campaigns that extended Hittite influence beyond Anatolia. His annals describe expeditions across the Taurus Mountains into northern Syria, targeting key urban centers such as Alalak, Urshu, and Hattusa. The destruction layer found at Alalak level 7 corresponds closely with this chronology, corroborating the textual account of Hittite assault. Control of these regions granted access to trade routes leading toward the Euphrates and the Levant, vital corridors for copper, tin, and textiles. By seizing them, Hattusili sought not only wealth but also geopolitical recognition. His armies now operated within the orbit of Mesopotamian diplomacy. The annals also reveal a degree of strategic calculation uncommon for this early period. Hattusili's campaigns were not simply raiding ventures but sequential efforts to secure logistical and political footholds. He installed loyal governors in conquered towns, deported skilled laborers to Anatolia, and imposed tribute systems to sustain future operations. These measures indicate a growing awareness of empire as an administrative project, a network of controlled territories rather than a collection of spoils. The deportations, though coercive, served an economic purpose. They redistributed human resources to strengthen the heartland's agricultural and artisanal base. Internally, Hattusili implemented early forms of legal and administrative reform that would define Hittite governance for generations. He standardized taxation and established royal oversight over temple revenues, thereby integrating religious and economic systems under state control. The appearance of officials titled Lugal-Dubsar, chief scribe, and Galmesidi, chief of the bodyguards, in administrative records reflects a professionalized court structure. The increasing use of Hittite language documents rather than Akkadian for domestic affairs signals the growing confidence of a literate bureaucracy operating in its own tongue. The fusion of military and bureaucratic authority under the king's supervision became the cornerstone of Hittite stability. 3 analytical insights clarify the significance of Hattusili's reign. First, the institutionalization of royal record-keeping, epitomized by the annals, demonstrates the emergence of a state ideology grounded in documentation and precedent. The king's actions were no longer ephemeral. They were preserved, scrutinized, and invoked as models for successors. Second, the integration of conquest and administration reflects a fundamental transformation from expansionist chieftaincy to managed sovereignty. Each campaign produced both territorial acquisition and bureaucratic adaptation. Third, Hattusili's choice of Hattusa as capital solidified the concept of a dynastic heartland, a sacred and political center whose permanence would sustain the kingdom through later cycles of instability. The final years of Hattusili's reign were marked by internal challenges that exposed the vulnerabilities of this new imperial order. According to later accounts, disputes over succession and rebellion among royal relatives threatened to unravel the dynasty. The Testament of Hattusili, another key text preserved in the royal archives, records his decision to designate his grandson, rather than his rebellious son, as heir. This document, written in the king's own voice, not only reveals the personal dimensions of rule, but also articulates a legal precedent for succession by decree, an early example of constitutional authority in the Near Eastern monarchy. By the time of his death around 1620 BCE, Hattusili I had redefined the political and geographical scope of the Hittite world. His campaigns established the first durable contact between Anatolia and northern Syria. His reforms institutionalized royal governance, and his annals set the precedent for a literate, self-conscious kingship. In combining the sword with the stylus, he created a model of rulership that fused conquest with administration, the twin foundations of all later Hittite power. But expansion bred instability, and succession struggles soon threatened the throne. In a single march to Babylon, the Hittites announced their arrival to the ancient world. The reign of Mursalai I circa 1620 to 1590 BCE stands as both the pinnacle and the undoing of the Hittite Old Kingdom. As the adopted heir and grandson of Hattusa I, Mursalai inherited a kingdom recently expanded yet internally fragile. His campaigns, particularly the legendary march that ended with the sack of Babylon, mark one of the most audacious episodes in early Near Eastern history. In one decisive thrust across the Fertile Crescent, a monarch from the Anatolian highlands altered the geopolitical order of Mesopotamia and proclaimed the Hittites a force of imperial stature. Yet this achievement was fleeting. Within months of his return, Mursalai was assassinated, and the kingdom he commanded dissolved into internal conflict. His triumph at Babylon thus remains both a testament to Hittite military reach and a cautionary example of imperial overextension. Upon ascending the throne, Mursalai inherited not only his grandfather's territories, but also his unresolved conflicts. The Testament of Hattusa had designated him successor over Hattusa's own son, creating enduring resentment among rival branches of the royal family. Nevertheless, Mursalai's early reign demonstrates political continuity. He retained Hattusa as his capital, maintained existing alliances, and continued expansionist policies in Syria. According to Hittite royal annals and later Mesopotamian references, Mursalai launched successive campaigns against Yamhad and Aleppo, two centers that had long resisted Hittite domination. Archaeological layers at Alalak and textual references in the Chronicle of the Early Kings corroborate widespread destruction in this region around 1600 BCE. With the fall of Aleppo, Mursalai gained control of northern Syrian trade routes and access to the Euphrates, creating the logistical foundation for the long southern expedition to follow. These campaigns exhibit a high degree of organization. Hittite forces, composed of chariot corps, infantry levies, and auxiliary contingents, advanced along established trade corridors, supported by supply depots and allied vassals. The deliberate progression from Anatolia through Syria toward Mesopotamia reveals not opportunistic raiding but strategic design, a recognition that control of riverine trade and grain production was essential to sustaining the kingdom's economy. The Babylonian expedition, traditionally dated to around 1595 BCE, was unprecedented in both scale and distance. The Hittite army marched nearly 1,200 kilometers from Hattusa to the lower Euphrates, a feat unmatched in the Bronze Age until centuries later. The motives remain debated. Some historians interpret the campaign as a retaliatory strike against Amorite polities allied with Aleppo. Others view it as a symbolic demonstration of Hittite power. Cuneiform sources from Mesopotamia, including the Babylonian Chronicle and the later synchronistic history, describe the sudden appearance of Hittite forces in Babylon, the city's capture, and the overthrow of the Amorite dynasty of Hammurabi. The attackers are identified as the Hittite troops of the land of Hutti, confirming external testimony of Mursalai's incursion. Archaeological layers at Babylon show evidence of limited destruction, consistent with a swift assault rather than prolonged siege. The Hittites looted the city's temples, seizing divine statues and immense stores of silver and grain. Yet, strikingly, they did not occupy Babylon. Instead, Mursalai withdrew almost immediately, retreating northward with his spoils. This abrupt departure remains one of the central enigmas of Hittite history. The prevailing interpretation suggests that the campaign's objective was prestige and plunder rather than territorial annexation. Babylon lay too far from Hutti's logistical reach to be governed effectively. Nevertheless, the consequences were profound. With the Amorite dynasty destroyed, a power vacuum emerged in southern Mesopotamia. Within decades, the Kassites, a mountain people from the Zagros, assumed control, founding a dynasty that would rule Babylon for nearly 4 centuries. Thus, Mursalai's raid indirectly reshaped Mesopotamian politics. By eliminating the old order, he cleared the stage for a new one. The Babylon campaign yielded enormous wealth, but it also exposed the fragility of Hittite governance. Transporting treasure and captives across Anatolia strained existing administrative mechanisms. Tribute management, population resettlement, and the redistribution of spoils required a stable bureaucracy, one that Hutti was only beginning to develop. Evidence from later Hittite law codes, which reference silver standards and military provisions, may reflect administrative responses to challenges first encountered under Mursalai. At the same time, the influx of wealth may have intensified factional rivalries. The royal court at Hattusa became a locus of intrigue, where kinship claims intersected with access to newly acquired resources. The Proclamation of Telepainu, written more than a century later, recalls this era as one of bloodshed and rebellion, blaming the downfall of early kings on internal treachery. Mursalai's reign ended abruptly in assassination, orchestrated by his brother-in-law Hantilai and possibly his own cupbearer Zidanta. The conspirators seized power, plunging the realm into civil disorder. No royal annals survive from this period. Archaeological evidence suggests the temporary abandonment of certain provincial centers. For several generations, the Hittite kingdom receded from international affairs. From a structural perspective, this collapse underscores the limits of early imperial expansion. Hattusili and Mursalai had extended their authority far beyond the logistical and administrative capacity of their state. The absence of codified succession law left the throne vulnerable to coups. Moreover, the reliance on plunder rather than stable taxation undermined long-term stability. The same military apparatus that conquered Babylon could not preserve order at home. Yet even in decline, Mursalai's expedition left an enduring imprint on the Near Eastern imagination. For Babylonians, it marked the sudden intrusion of a distant power from the north, an event later remembered as divine punishment. For the Hittites, it established a model of royal ambition that future kings would emulate on a more sustainable scale. The annalistic tradition he inherited from Hattusili continued, ensuring that even amid collapse, the idea of kingship as recorded authority endured. After the triumph came silence, a century of turmoil and rebuilding. The blood of kings stained the tablets of Hattusa. The aftermath of Mursalai I's assassination around 1590 BCE plunged the Hittite kingdom into one of the most violent and poorly documented periods in its history. For nearly a century, the land of Hutti was governed not by stability or law, but by conspiracy, regicide, and fluctuating royal legitimacy. The very mechanisms that had supported imperial expansion under Hattusili and Mursalai, hereditary monarchy, military aristocracy, and a centralized palace system, now became instruments of fragmentation. The principal source for this era, the Proclamation of Telepainu, written roughly a century later, offers both a historical record and a moral reflection. Composed by King Telepainu, circa 1525 BCE, it recounts the sequence of murders and usurpations that followed Mursalai's death. Although written retrospectively to justify reforms, the document preserves the clearest narrative of how unchecked ambition and familial rivalry eroded the foundations of Hittite kingship. After Mursalai's return from Babylon, a conspiracy led by his brother-in-law Hantilai and the royal cupbearer Zidanta ended his life. This act of regicide inaugurated a pattern that would repeat for generations. Hantilai seized the throne but ruled under constant insecurity, aware that his own power rested on murder. The Proclamation of Telepainu states that the princes began to kill one another, a concise yet devastating summary of the decades that followed. Hantilai's reign was consumed by both internal and external pressures. While he managed to retain control of central Anatolia, the distant Syrian possessions acquired by Mursalai, including Aleppo and Alalak, were lost. The withdrawal from Syria marked a strategic contraction of the Hittite sphere, returning the kingdom to a more insular posture. Cuneiform records from northern Syria suggest that local dynasties quickly reasserted independence, and Egyptian correspondence from the 18th dynasty no longer lists Hutti among its contemporaries. Following Hantilai's death, his co-conspirator Zidanta took the throne, reportedly after murdering Hantilai's heirs. His reign, too, was short-lived and violent. Archaeological evidence from Hattusa reveals signs of destruction during this period, possibly reflecting factional warfare or civil unrest. The palace system, once the locus of centralized administration, fragmented into competing power bases. This political disintegration coincided with economic stagnation. Trade with Assyrian markets declined, and the standardized silver system established under Hattusa disappeared from surviving tablets. Zidanta was eventually overthrown by Amuna, whose name appears in fragmentary administrative documents but whose reign is remembered in the proclamation as one of lawlessness. Telepainu later wrote that during these years, brother killed brother, son killed father, a statement that, while rhetorical, conveys the pervasive atmosphere of dynastic violence. Amuna's successors, Hosea I and Telepainu, would finally attempt to restore legitimacy, but not before decades of instability had nearly destroyed the royal institution. The period following Mursali's death saw the dissolution of central authority in both administrative and symbolic terms. Royal titles lost their sanctity. Succession became a matter of force rather than lineage. The king, once the divine intermediary between the gods and the realm, now faced challenges not only from rivals but also from the palace elite, generals, cupbearers, and scribes who increasingly acted as autonomous agents. This breakdown is visible in the archaeological record. At Hattusa, several early palace structures fell out of use, and storage facilities were repurposed. The reduction in cuneiform archives from this period suggests a temporary collapse of bureaucratic continuity. Regional centers such as Zipalanda and Nerik, once closely integrated into the royal economy, show signs of decreased central oversight. The Hittite heartland did not fall into complete anarchy, but it reverted to a patchwork of semi-independent city-states reminiscent of the pre-imperial era. Three analytical themes emerge from this phase. First, the military aristocracy's politicization undermined the principle of hereditary succession. Without codified rules of inheritance, every transition became a potential coup. Second, the religious dimension of kingship weakened. With each regicide, the divine aura surrounding the Labarna title, the symbolic embodiment of royal continuity, diminished. Third, the economic contraction resulting from territorial loss and internal disorder eroded the fiscal foundations of governance. Without steady tribute from Syria or secure trade with Assyria, the Hittite treasury could no longer sustain its bureaucracy or army. The proclamation of Telepainu, though written later, remains indispensable for reconstructing this period's chronology. Its dual character, part historical chronicle, part legal reform, reveals how the memory of violence became an argument for institutional renewal. Telepainu recounts the preceding century as a moral decline from the golden age of Labarna and Hattusa. His narrative lists the succession of assassinations, the loss of foreign lands, and the collapse of royal dignity, culminating in a legal decree that sought to regulate royal succession and limit courtly interference. In the proclamation, Telepainu stipulates that the throne should pass first to a son, then to a brother, then to a grandson, a codification of inheritance unprecedented in Hittite law. This attempt to impose order on dynastic politics reveals an awareness of systemic failure. The kingdom's survival depended on predictable succession. The document also prohibits blood vengeance and palace conspiracies, appealing to divine justice rather than personal revenge. In doing so, Telepainu transformed the monarchy from a hereditary prize into a legal institution. The proclamation's historical accuracy has been debated. It simplifies complex events and omits entire reigns, suggesting both selective memory and political intent. Yet its value lies precisely in its perspective, as a royal acknowledgement of institutional weakness. By turning history into legal precedent, the Hittites began to define legitimacy through codified law rather than brute power. While internal strife consumed the Hittite heartland, the geopolitical landscape of the Near East shifted dramatically. The power vacuum left by Mursali's withdrawal from Babylon allowed the Kassite dynasty to consolidate in southern Mesopotamia, while in Syria, new polities such as Mitanni and Kizzuwatna rose to prominence. These states absorbed the trade networks and diplomatic channels once controlled by Hutti. Egyptian inscriptions from the early New Kingdom refer to these northern rivals but make no mention of the Hittites. evidence that the kingdom had temporarily vanished from the international stage. This retreat had lasting consequences. The loss of access to Syrian copper, timber, and grain deprived Hutti of vital resources. Moreover, the symbolic cost was immense. The Hittite kings, who had once reached Babylon, now ruled a diminished territory confined to the Anatolian plateau. This reversal underscores the volatility of early empire building, where expansion without durable institutions led inevitably to collapse. To survive, the kingdom would need a new moral and legal foundation. Amid chaos, a reformer sought permanence through law. When Telepainu ascended the Hittite throne around 1525 BCE, the kingdom was weary from decades of instability. The reigns following Mursalai had been defined by assassinations, usurpations, and the disintegration of royal power. Territories in northern Syria were lost, vassal loyalty had evaporated, and the royal court in Hattusa had become a battlefield for factions. It was in this atmosphere of political exhaustion that Telepainu attempted something unprecedented in Hittite history: to transform kingship from a personal and violent contest into an institution governed by law. The primary source for this transformation is the proclamation of Telepainu, a royal edict inscribed on clay tablets and distributed across the realm. Archaeologists uncovered these fragments at Hattusa in the early 20th century, providing direct insight into the political philosophy of a Bronze Age monarch. The text opens with a narrative of decline, recounting the glory of earlier kings, their conquests, and the justice of their rule, before describing the moral and political decay that followed. By invoking this contrast, Telepainu established legitimacy not through divine right or conquest, but through reform and restoration. At the heart of his proclamation was a codified law of succession. The throne was to pass strictly through the male line, first to the king's sons, and if none were eligible, to his brothers or their sons. This rule aimed to prevent the coups and regicides that had plagued earlier generations. The edict explicitly forbade assassinations and palace conspiracies, declaring that whoever commits such an act, his blood shall be upon his own head. While this principle was idealistic in a world accustomed to violent transitions, it represented a conceptual shift. The throne was no longer a prize seized by might, but a lineage protected by legal continuity. These reforms were not purely moral, they served an administrative function as well. Telepainu reorganized the court and reasserted royal oversight over provincial governors and vassal lords. Records indicate the revival of local councils, panchis, a deliberative body that could advise the king and adjudicate disputes involving members of the royal family. Scholars debate the extent of its power. Some view it as a symbolic concession to noble elites, while others see in it the early form of a constitutional institution. In either case, the panchis embodied a new attempt to institutionalize justice within the framework of monarchy. Telepainu's legal vision extended beyond succession. Under his reign, existing Hittite legal traditions were codified into written form, preserving norms that had likely circulated orally for centuries. Fragments of these early law codes, discovered in the archives of Hattusa, cover a wide range of civil and criminal matters: theft, injury, land disputes, and marriage. Unlike the punitive legalism of Mesopotamian codes such as Hammurabi's, Hittite law was notably pragmatic and compensatory. Fines and restitution often replaced capital punishment, suggesting a legal culture concerned with social balance rather than retribution. This emphasis on proportionality hints at an early administrative rationality, in which justice served to maintain order rather than display royal wrath. The proclamation also redefined the moral role of the king. Whereas earlier rulers derived legitimacy from conquest and divine favor, Telepainu presented himself as a restorer of order and harmony. His rhetoric emphasized fairness, remembrance, and continuity, concepts rare in royal inscriptions of the ancient Near East. By invoking the memory of the great ancestors, he positioned his rule not as revolutionary but restorative, aligning the monarchy with the principle of historical legitimacy. This use of memory as political authority would remain a recurring feature of Hittite statecraft. From an analytical perspective, Telepainu's reforms mark a decisive step in the evolution of early statehood. They reveal the transition from a warrior aristocracy to a bureaucratic monarchy bound by codified norms. His legal framework did not eliminate factionalism, but it provided a model for dynastic continuity that later kings could invoke. In institutional terms, this codification allowed the monarchy to survive periods of weakness without total collapse, an achievement that distinguishes Hutti from many of its contemporaries. Archaeological layers from Hattusa and nearby centers indicate that, by the end of Telopainu's reign, administrative stability had begun to return. New construction projects, standardized seal impressions, and resumed correspondence with neighboring polities suggest that the kingdom's bureaucracy was functioning once more. The return of order, however fragile, allowed Hutti to reassert influence over central Anatolia and to maintain control of trade routes linking east and west. In the broader scope of Near Eastern history, Telopainu's reforms reflect an early awareness of the dangers of unchecked royal power. By embedding the succession and judicial systems within written law, the Hittites took a conceptual step toward the impersonal state, one that could endure beyond the personality of any single ruler. This legal foundation would later support the rise of the Hittite New Kingdom, whose kings would govern an empire stretching from the Aegean to the Euphrates. By the time of Telopainu's death, the kingdom was once again cohesive, though modest in reach. The wars and regicides had ceased, and the palace at Hattusa stood as the administrative heart of a restored Anatolian state. The memory of his reforms endured in Hittite legal and political culture for centuries, cited by later kings as precedent. Stability had returned, and with it the capacity for expansion. Stability allowed the kingdom to recover, paving the way for renewed expansion. For a century, the Hittites rebuilt, quietly forging the empire that would follow. In the wake of Telopainu's reforms, the Hittite kingdom entered a long phase of consolidation and recovery, traditionally termed the Middle Kingdom, spanning roughly from 1500 to 1400 BCE. The surviving evidence from this era, sparse yet telling, portrays a state reestablishing its internal coherence, reasserting agricultural productivity, and reconstructing its administrative institutions. Unlike the dramatic expansions of earlier kings, this was a period of restoration rather than conquest, during which the structural foundations of the later empire were quietly set in place. Archaeological layers at Hattusa show gradual urban revival. After the destructive episodes of the 17th century, new fortifications were erected on the Acropolis, storage facilities expanded, and the lower city once again filled with residential and workshop zones. Excavations at Sapinua, a major provincial center east of the capital, reveal a similar pattern of rebuilding, carefully planned storage silos, administrative buildings, and archives containing hundreds of clay tablets. These tablets, many inscribed in Old Hittite and Hurrian, document inventories, agricultural deliveries, and ritual provisions, reflecting a maturing bureaucracy capable of managing both religious and economic life. The economic revitalization of this period rested on agriculture. Anatolia's rugged terrain required constant management of water and land resources, and evidence from rural settlements indicates renewed attention to irrigation and terrace cultivation. Grain production, particularly barley and emmer wheat, became more reliable, enabling surplus collection through state granaries. Records suggest that the redistribution of grain and livestock was regulated through a standardized taxation system, a development signaling the reestablishment of royal authority at the local level. The revival of farming and herding not only stabilized subsistence but also supplied the resources necessary for maintaining a standing administrative apparatus. Religious syncretism also deepened during the Middle Kingdom, contributing to ideological unity. The Hittites, already a composite society of Indo-European and Hattusan elements, increasingly incorporated Hurrian and Syrian deities into their pantheon. Archaeological evidence from temples in Hattusa and Alacahoyuk shows dedications to storm gods, sun deities, and local tutelary spirits written in multiple languages. This inclusiveness served both a theological and a political function. By acknowledging the gods of conquered or allied regions, the Hittite kings reinforced loyalty and facilitated integration across diverse populations. Inscriptions from this period frequently mention the 1,000 gods of Hutti, a phrase that encapsulated the pluralistic structure of Hittite religion. Administratively, the Middle Kingdom witnessed a refinement of local governance. Provincial centers such as Sapinua, Samaha, and Tapaka operated as regional nodes linked to the capital through a hierarchy of officials. Texts mention governors, Galmesidi, and high stewards, Hazanu, who managed land assignments, organized labor, and ensured the flow of tribute. This bureaucratic framework allowed the monarchy to project authority over distant territories without direct military occupation. Seal impressions from these sites show standardized iconography and formulas, suggesting the emergence of a cohesive administrative style under royal supervision. The Middle Kingdom kings whose names survive only fragmentarily, such as Hantili II, Zidanta II, and possibly Amuna II, maintained continuity with Telepainu's legal and moral framework. Their reigns are characterized less by military expansion than by internal consolidation. Correspondence tablets indicate diplomatic exchanges with Kizzuwatna and northern Syria, demonstrating that foreign relations were conducted primarily through treaties and intermarriage rather than warfare. The pattern suggests a deliberate restraint, as the kingdom prioritized stability over territorial ambition. From an interpretive standpoint, this period reveals how administrative endurance can precede imperial resurgence. The reforms of Telepainu had stabilized the monarchy, but the Middle Kingdom transformed that stability into a functioning apparatus of governance. The organization of archives, standardization of legal formulae, and control of agricultural production collectively demonstrate the early emergence of what historians call the Hittite state system. It was in these bureaucratic routines, the storage of grain, the recording of offerings, the sealing of inventories, that the institutional backbone of the later Great Kingdom was formed. Archaeologists at Sapinua have noted a significant increase in textual documentation during this phase. The presence of bilingual tablets in Hittite and Hurrian indicates not only administrative multilingualism but also the growing cosmopolitan nature of Hittite governance. The scribal schools active at these sites likely trained officials in cuneiform literacy, a skill crucial for sustaining communication across the expanding political network. This emphasis on record-keeping would later allow the great kings of the 14th century to coordinate vast territories from Hattusa to Aleppo. Religious and administrative developments were mutually reinforcing. The temples functioned not only as ritual centers, but also as repositories of wealth and records. Offerings, inventories, and personnel lists found in temple archives attest to the dual economic and spiritual role of religion within the Hittite system. This overlap of sacred and bureaucratic authority foreshadowed the later integration of priestly and royal functions under the imperial cult. By 1400 BCE, the evidence suggests a stable, literate, and well-governed Anatolian kingdom, modest in territorial reach but internally coherent. Its kings ruled from fortified capitals linked by administrative networks, its economy produced consistent surpluses, and its temples unified diverse ethnic and linguistic groups under a shared ritual calendar. The Middle Kingdom thus represents less a pause between empires than a crucial transformation from recovery to readiness. In silence and order, the Hittite state was reshaped into an instrument capable of commanding an empire. By the 14th century BCE, a new generation of rulers would lead Hutti into its golden age. With the Tadalias, Hutti rose once more, uniting the plateau under iron and law. By the early 14th century BCE, the Hittite realm, revived through a century of recovery, entered a new era of expansion and consolidation. Under Tudhaliya I and his successor Tudhaliya II, the kings of Hutti reasserted dominance across central and western Anatolia, overcoming both internal weakness and external threats. This period marks the formal emergence of the Great Kingdom, a political and military system capable of sustained imperial control. The annalistic texts and diplomatic correspondence from this time show that the Hittite court had regained both confidence and strategic coherence, transforming Hutti into a unified and assertive power. Archaeological evidence from Hattusa indicates that the city, which had experienced partial abandonment in the previous century, was rebuilt on a monumental scale. Fortifications expanded to enclose new quarters of the lower city, and vast gates, such as the Lion Gate and King's Gate, were constructed from finely dressed limestone blocks. The urban reconstruction was not merely architectural but symbolic. Hattusa once again stood as the political and religious heart of Anatolia. Excavations reveal administrative tablets referencing renewed building programs and regional taxation, suggesting a reorganized system of labor conscription and tribute collection. These measures indicate that Tudhaliya's government sought to institutionalize its authority through both infrastructure and bureaucracy. The military campaigns of Tudhaliya I-II were directed primarily toward two fronts: the western regions dominated by Arzawa and the northern frontier threatened by the Kaska tribes. In western Anatolia, the Hittite kings confronted the Arzawan Confederation, a loose coalition of city-states stretching from the Meander River basin to the Aegean coast. Records describe a series of campaigns aimed at securing strategic routes and subduing rebellious vassals. Though the victories were uneven, the eventual subjugation of western territories established a precedent for later imperial expansion under Suppiluliuma I. The conquest of Arzawa also opened access to key metal resources and trade corridors, integrating western Anatolia into the Hittite sphere. To the north, the Kaska presented a different kind of challenge. These mountain tribes, occupying the Pontic Range along the Black Sea, waged near-constant raids on Hittite settlements. Annals from this period describe burning of frontier towns, theft of livestock, and the occasional capture of cult statues, a sacrilegious act that underscored the instability of the region. Tudhaliya's campaigns against the Kaska were largely defensive but strategically essential. By re-establishing fortified outposts and constructing watchtowers along river valleys, the Hittite state attempted to impose permanent control on a landscape resistant to central authority. Archaeological surveys in the northern frontier zones confirm the presence of new fortifications and storage installations dating to this era. The geopolitical environment of the 14th century demanded a flexible blend of warfare and diplomacy. Tudhaliya's reign demonstrates the increasing sophistication of Hittite foreign relations. Treaties from this period, particularly those with the Kingdom of Kizzuwatna in southeastern Anatolia, reflect mutual defense alliances and dynastic marriages designed to stabilize borders. The integration of Kizzuwatna was of special importance. Its control of the Cilician Gates, the principal pass into Syria, provided both strategic depth and access to the Levantine trade routes. The incorporation of its Hurrian religious and administrative elements also strengthened the cultural pluralism of the Hittite court. Textual evidence reveals the administrative maturity achieved during this reign. The cuneiform archives of Hattusa record detailed instructions concerning vassal obligations, troop levies, and logistical arrangements. The structure of the central government was becoming more defined. Provincial governors administered taxes, temple estates supplied rations for troops, and the king's annals formalized the concept of royal accountability. This bureaucratic sophistication mirrored developments in Egypt and Mesopotamia, situating Hutti among the great literate powers of the Late Bronze Age. From an interpretive perspective, the Tudhaliya era represents the consolidation of a truly imperial identity. Earlier Hittite kings had ruled as regional monarchs over loosely aligned territories, but by the mid-14th century, the language of the royal inscriptions began to shift. The king now referred to himself as Great King, an explicit recognition of parity with other Near Eastern sovereigns such as the Pharaoh of Egypt and the King of Babylon. This ideological shift was accompanied by a ceremonial one. Royal processions, monumental reliefs, and temple dedications emphasized divine sanction and continuity with the gods of Hutti. Archaeologists have uncovered several foundation inscriptions and building reliefs associated with Tudhaliya I-II, underscoring the ritual importance of kingship in the process of state consolidation. These works emphasize the divine favor granted by the storm god Tarhunt and the sun goddess of Arina, deities whose protection legitimized the dynasty's renewed claim to power. Religious continuity thus became a political instrument, linking the restored capital to its mythic past and providing moral cohesion to an expanding realm. Despite persistent northern raids and intermittent rebellions, the Tudhaliya period achieved relative internal stability. The consistent use of seals, administrative tablets, and royal correspondence from this era reflects a centralized apparatus functioning with notable efficiency. The bureaucratic titles recorded Gal Dub.Sar, chief scribe, Lmesukal, messenger officials, and Galel.Mekur, chief of the troops, illustrate a layered system of governance with defined hierarchies and delegated authority. These offices institutionalized royal control beyond personal charisma or military success, ensuring continuity even during transitions of power. From a systemic standpoint, the Tidalias transformed the Hittite state from a kingdom of recovery into an organized, multi-regional empire. The rebuilding of Hattusa, the expansion of administrative literacy, and the establishment of frontier defenses all demonstrate a long-term strategy of state formation. This was not merely the restoration of earlier power but the creation of a durable imperial framework, one capable of coordinating campaigns across Anatolia and maintaining communication with Syria and Mesopotamia. By the end of Tudhaliatu's reign, Hutti had regained its stature as a major power. The foundations of the Great Kingdom, territorial cohesion, military capability, and bureaucratic efficiency were now firmly in place. This stability prepared the stage for one of antiquity's most formidable kings. Suppiluliuma transformed a kingdom into an empire recognized from Egypt to Babylon. By the mid-14th century BCE, the Hittite state, long stabilized under the Tidalias, was poised for extraordinary expansion. The ascension of Suppiluliuma I, often regarded as the greatest of all Hittite monarchs, marked the culmination of centuries of consolidation and reform. His reign, circa 1350 to 1322 BCE, witnessed a transformation of Hutti from an Anatolian kingdom into a dominant Near Eastern empire. Through military conquest, administrative sophistication, and shrewd diplomacy, Suppiluliuma reshaped the political geography of the Late Bronze Age. Our knowledge of his reign derives largely from the deeds of Suppiluliuma, a series of annals compiled by his son Mursalai II, and from numerous treaties, letters, and cuneiform fragments recovered at Hattusa. Together, these sources reveal a ruler of formidable energy and calculation. The campaigns and correspondence of Suppiluliuma display not only military acumen but also a nuanced understanding of interstate politics in an era defined by rival great powers: Egypt, Mitanni, Assyria, and Babylon. When Suppiluliuma seized the throne, Hutti faced renewed threats from the north and instability in Syria. The once powerful Mitanni kingdom, Hutti's eastern rival, had weakened due to internal dynastic struggles and pressure from Assyria. Suppiluliuma exploited this vacuum with precision. His early campaigns secured control of northern Syria, beginning with the conquest of Carchemish and Aleppo, two critical urban centers that had alternately served Mitanni and Egyptian interests. Archaeological evidence from these sites, including Hittite-style seals and administrative tablets, confirms the establishment of permanent Hittite garrisons and local governance under viceroys loyal to Hattusa. The Syrian conquests marked a turning point in Near Eastern geopolitics. For the first time, Hittite influence extended to the Euphrates, placing it in direct contact and competition with both Assyria to the east and Egypt to the south. Suppiluliuma's expansion was not purely militaristic. He consolidated his victories through a network of treaties that defined the Hittite imperial order. These treaties, many preserved in the Hattusa archives, followed a consistent legal format: a historical preamble, stipulations of loyalty, clauses guaranteeing the succession of vassal rulers, and ritual oaths invoking the gods of Hutti as witnesses. The vassal treaties with Aleppo, Kadesh, and Amurru illustrate a clear hierarchy. Local kings retained autonomy in domestic matters but owed military aid, tribute, and exclusive allegiance to the Hittite monarch. One of Suppiluliuma's most significant achievements was the systematic reorganization of his new territories into a viceroyal system. The viceroy of Carchemish, often a royal prince, governed northern Syria, while the viceroy of Aleppo administered the southern zone. This arrangement ensured efficient communication and loyalty to the central government. Archaeological findings from Carchemish, including royal seals bearing the names of Suppiluliuma's sons, confirm the familial and administrative integration of Syria into the Hittite imperial framework. The combination of military subjugation, administrative delegation, and religious legitimation produced a model of imperial governance that would persist for generations. The Amarna correspondence, a cache of diplomatic letters discovered in Egypt, provides valuable external confirmation of Suppiluliuma's international prominence. Letters from contemporary Near Eastern monarchs address him as an equal, using the formulaic title Great King. These communications reveal a balance of power system where prestige and parity were as critical as territorial control. The exchange of gifts, envoys, and royal marriages served to reinforce alliances and mutual recognition among the major powers. Suppiluliuma's correspondence with the Egyptian court, in particular, illustrates his growing influence and leads directly to one of the most enigmatic episodes of late Bronze Age diplomacy, the Dakamunzu affair. According to the Hittite annals, following the death of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, a letter arrived at Hattusa from an Egyptian queen, identified only by the Hurrianized name Dakamunzu, derived from Ta-Hemet Nisu, the king's wife. In her letter, she implored Suppiluliuma to send one of his sons to Egypt to become her husband and assume the throne, declaring that she had no son of her own. This unprecedented request, an Egyptian queen seeking a foreign consort, astonished the Hittite court. After initial skepticism, Suppiluliuma dispatched an envoy to verify the situation. When the queen's plea was confirmed, he sent his son Zenanza to Egypt. However, Zenanza was murdered en route, likely by political factions hostile to foreign intervention. The episode had far-reaching consequences. Suppiluliuma, enraged by what he perceived as Egyptian treachery, launched retaliatory raids into Egyptian-held territories in Syria, notably around Amka and Kadesh. These campaigns brought short-term gains but introduced instability into the frontier zone. Moreover, they exposed Hittite troops to an epidemic, possibly plague, brought back from the Levant. Cuneiform records lament the devastation caused by this contagion, which claimed countless lives, including Suppiluliuma himself. Thus, the same diplomacy that symbolized the empire's zenith also precipitated its first major crisis. From a historical and analytical standpoint, Suppiluliuma's reign represents the fullest expression of Hittite imperial capacity. His expansion unified Anatolia and northern Syria under a single administrative system, while his diplomacy placed Hutti among the quartet of great powers that dominated the late Bronze Age world. The vassal treaties codified a legalistic model of empire that balanced coercion with obligation, a structure later emulated by Assyrian and Persian rulers. His policies demonstrated how warfare, law, and religion could be harmonized within a coherent vision of statecraft. Archaeologically, the material record corroborates this transformation. At Hattusa, new palatial complexes and archives proliferated. The density of cuneiform tablets, ranging from annals to diplomatic texts, attests to the bureaucratic sophistication achieved under his administration. In northern Syria, the appearance of Hittite glyptic art, pottery, and architectural styles reflects both colonization and cultural integration. These findings confirm that Suppiluliuma's empire was not merely a military network but a cultural and administrative organism with enduring influence. Interpretively, Suppiluliuma's success illustrates the apex of Hittite adaptability. The state's Indo-European core absorbed Hurrian and Semitic traditions, producing a syncretic imperial culture capable of bridging Anatolia and the Levant. His reign marked the high tide of Hittite prestige, acknowledged by Egypt, feared by Assyria, and respected by Babylon. Yet his very achievements sowed the seeds of later vulnerability. Rapid expansion strained resources, and the plague weakened both the royal household and the military elite. By the end of his reign, Suppiluliuma had secured Hutti's place among the great empires of his age, but his death left a fragile inheritance. The kings who followed would struggle to preserve the unity he had achieved against mounting external and internal pressures. But greatness invited new challenges, external wars and internal rivalries. After the conqueror came the chronicler, a king who left history in his own words. When Suppiluliuma I's reign ended in triumph shadowed by plague, his son Mursilai II ascended the throne amid uncertainty. Barely more than a youth, he inherited not only a vast empire but also the consequences of its reach, rebellious vassals, fragile alliances, and a disease that had carried away his father and brother alike. Yet, from these conditions of turmoil, Mursilai would prove himself one of Hutti's most capable rulers, restoring the empire's structure through discipline, administration, and the written record. Unlike his predecessors, who are known chiefly through the echoes of their deeds, Mursalai too speaks directly through his annals. These texts, inscribed meticulously upon clay, offer one of the earliest autobiographical accounts in ancient history, a ruler not mythologized by later scribes but self-narrated in the present tense of power. His campaigns against rebellious territories in Arzawa, the Kaska lands to the north, and the western vassals were not merely exercises in conquest, but in order the reimposition of the Hittite legal and religious framework over a disordered periphery. Each entry in his record balances military precision with theological reflection. Victories are attributed not only to arms but to the favor of the gods, especially the storm god of Hutti. Amid this consolidation, a crisis of another kind haunted the land, the great plague that had begun in his father's time. The tablets reveal Mursalai's profound anxiety. Prayers to the gods for relief, confessions of ritual impurity, and pleas for forgiveness on behalf of his lineage. To modern readers, these passages expose the emotional dimension of kingship in the ancient world. The Hittite ruler was not a distant autocrat but a mediator between divine justice and human frailty. Through his words, we glimpse a civilization both powerful and introspective, bureaucratic, yet burdened by guilt and fate. Administratively, Mursalai too advanced the bureaucratic mechanisms that had begun under his father. Provincial governors were reorganized, vassal treaties reaffirmed, and scribal record-keeping expanded. His reign marked the high point of Hittite textual culture. Royal decrees, legal codes, and historical annals flourished, all preserved within the archive chambers of Hattusa. The rhythm of his rule, record, reform, remembrance, suggests a society reaching full maturity in governance and self-awareness. By the end of his reign, the frontiers of the empire were stable, and the institutions of record and ritual had been harmonized into a durable system. Yet his own writings, filled with omens and divine petitions, hint at the fragility that lay beneath the surface. The plague had not vanished, nor had the constant tension between the throne and the provinces. Target audience insight. For viewers, Mursalai too embodies the paradox of the Hittite Empire, at once methodical and mystical, rational in administration yet deeply spiritual in its understanding of fate. His reign represents the moment when empire became memory, and history itself became a tool of governance. Logical transition. His son would inherit both empire and uncertainty. No single god ruled Hutti. Every mountain and river had its own voice. Across the rocky highlands of central Anatolia, the people of Hutti lived in a world alive with divinity. To the Hittites, the earth itself spoke through the murmuring of rivers, the flash of lightning, the cry of a bird. There was no single god to command their devotion, only a chorus, vast and unending, known in later texts as the 1,000 gods of Hutti. This pantheon was less a fixed order than a living landscape, where each region, each city, and even each household maintained its own divine patrons. At the heart of this religious world stood the storm god of Hutti, lord of the sky, bringer of rain, guarantor of fertility and victory, and his consort, the sun goddess of Irina, radiant mother of order and life. Their union formed the cosmic balance upon which Hittite kingship rested. Yet, unlike the monolithic gods of later empires, the storm god was not singular. There were many storm gods, of Narik, of Zipalanda, of Aleppo, each local, each distinct, each folded into the empire's theology through diplomacy and ritual. This inclusivity was deliberate. As Hittite armies absorbed neighboring lands, from the Hurrian cities of Syria to the Luwian enclaves of western Anatolia, their gods were not erased but adopted. Through this syncretism, religion became an instrument of political cohesion. Treaties were sworn not only by kings but by their gods, whose names were enumerated in long lists to sanctify oaths. The pantheon thus mirrored the empire itself, complex, layered, and federated, a divine reflection of imperial bureaucracy. One of the most striking manifestations of this theology endures in stone at Yazilikaya, a sanctuary carved into limestone cliffs near Hattusa. There, Processions of gods and goddesses march in eternal relief, meeting in the central chamber beneath the open sky. The images reveal a cosmology where order is visualized through ritual sequence. Gods of storm and mountain, of fertility and warfare, all arranged in precise hierarchy. To the Hittites, this was not mere art but a cosmic register, a mirror of the universe set in rock, where the divine assembly validated the human one in Hattusa's palace halls. The influence of Hurrian religion, imported through the conquests of Mesopotamia I, deepened this pantheon's richness. Gods like Tezhub and Hepit, once foreign, were integrated seamlessly into Hittite worship, merging with native deities or coexisting beside them. The Hittite scribes translated Hurrian hymns into their own language, preserving myths like the Song of Kamarbi, a tale of divine succession and cosmic struggle that would later echo in Greek stories of Cronus and Zeus. Through such texts, we glimpse the crosscurrents of ancient myth, the transmission of sacred ideas across mountains and centuries. Ritual in Hutti was as practical as it was mystical. Daily temple offerings maintained divine favor, while great seasonal festivals, especially the Purulli festival of spring, reenacted creation myths to renew the world's order. Priests, augurs, and diviners occupied key positions in the court, interpreting omens in the flight of birds or the pattern of oil on water. The king himself was chief priest of the realm, responsible for performing the sacred duties that upheld the bond between the gods and the land. His neglect, as later texts warn, could invite drought, plague, or defeat. In this sense, religion was not separate from governance, it was governance. To rule was to mediate between the divine and human spheres, ensuring that cosmic equilibrium mirrored political stability. The rituals that filled Hattusa's temples were not mere gestures of piety, but the heartbeat of empire, sustaining both harvest and hierarchy. Through their 1,000 gods, the Hittites expressed a worldview of tolerance and integration, a theology as plural as the empire it sustained. Their pantheon remains one of the ancient world's most intricate spiritual mosaics, a blend of Indo-European, Anatolian, and Near Eastern traditions united by the conviction that every place, every element, carried a spark of divinity. Religion guided not only worship but justice. On clay tablets, justice found permanence. In the archives of Hattusa, tens of thousands of clay tablets bear witness to the ordered mind of the Hittite state. Written in cuneiform, their surfaces record decrees, legal judgments, treaties, and administrative memoranda. Together, they outline a civilization governed not by arbitrary command but by a codified and bureaucratic system, one of the most advanced of the Late Bronze Age. The Hittite law code, preserved on tablets dating to the 17th and 16th centuries BCE, demonstrates this precision. Unlike the rigid retributive justice of the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, Hittite law emphasized restitution and proportionality. Penalties were generally fines in silver rather than physical punishment. Homicide, for example, could be compensated by payment to the victim's family. Theft and property disputes were resolved through agreed settlements. This suggests a society concerned with restoring balance rather than inflicting vengeance. Scholars note that such moderation reflected the agrarian and communal character of Hittite life, a legal philosophy aimed at preserving social cohesion in a kingdom of towns and villages spread across difficult terrain. The laws also illuminate the state's administrative priorities. Detailed clauses regulate livestock ownership, boundary disputes, and labor obligations. Agricultural productivity was a state concern, and legal norms ensured stability in a landscape where every harvest determined survival. Provisions concerning temple property and priestly conduct reveal the interdependence of religion and law, while regulations on marriage, inheritance, and slavery illustrate a structured hierarchy tempered by pragmatic fairness. Administration extended beyond legislation to a complex bureaucratic apparatus. At its summit stood the great king, assisted by the Gal Mesidi, chief of the royal bodyguards, provincial governors, and a tiered network of officials who managed land allotments, tax collection, and corvée labor. The Lugal Dub.Sar, the royal scribe, oversaw archives and ensured that correspondence and decrees were copied and circulated across the realm. Archaeological excavations at Hattusa, Sapinua, and Ordokoi have uncovered storerooms lined with tablet shelves, attesting to the routine recording of every transaction and decree. Cuneiform writing itself was a legacy of earlier Mesopotamian contact. The Hittites adapted it to their own Indo-European tongue while retaining Akkadian for international correspondence. Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the Late Bronze Age, connected Hutti with Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. Letters preserved from the Amarna archive in Egypt reveal the fluency of Hittite scribes in this shared script. Evidence of an educated elite trained in multiple languages for both domestic and foreign administration. Education in scribal schools followed established Mesopotamian traditions. Apprentices learned Sumerian and Akkadian vocabulary lists, mathematical tables, and model contracts before mastering the Hittite syllabary. The process could take years, producing bureaucrats who were as much scholars as administrators. This educated class maintained continuity across reigns, ensuring that royal edicts were recorded, treaties preserved, and archives kept in systematic order. The bureaucratic culture of literacy thus underpinned the durability of the empire, allowing successive kings to inherit not only land and armies but institutional memory. Hittite law and administration also reveal a striking sense of procedural formality. Royal decrees began with invocations of the gods and the king's name, followed by stipulations and penalties. Treaties, such as the one between Suppiluliuma I and the vassal states of Syria, adhered to a fixed structure. Historical prologue, terms of loyalty, divine witnesses, and curses upon oathbreakers. This standardization, repeated across generations, reflects a bureaucratic mindset dedicated to precedent and record hallmarks of a stable imperial order. Interpretive evidence from the Telepainu Proclamation underscores this continuity. When Telepainu sought to reform succession and governance, his decrees were preserved on tablets and disseminated throughout the realm, an early example of codified constitutional law. The durability of these reforms, transmitted by the scribal bureaucracy, helped re-establish royal authority after decades of instability. In the rhythm of these tablets, law codes, contracts, treaties, one perceives the logic of the Hittite state. Justice was codified, memory was material, and governance was conducted through written precedent. The empire's endurance across centuries owed much to this administrative infrastructure, which translated royal will into durable record and regional compliance. Such organization sustained the economy and trade that fed the empire. Beyond the palaces of kings, life in Hutti followed the rhythm of field and forge. Beneath the commanding architecture of Hattusa and the inscriptions of kings, the Hittite world functioned through the labor and customs of its people. Archaeological remains, legal codes, and temple accounts provide a clear image of a stratified but interdependent society, one organized around agriculture, service to the crown, and religious obligation. At the top of this social hierarchy stood the great king and queen, embodiments of divine authority. The Tawananna, or queen, held independent power, presiding over cult rituals and palace administration even after her husband's death. Below them, a noble class of Lugal lords and Gal Mesidi, commanders, governed provincial centers and led armies. The military aristocracy enjoyed estates granted by the crown, often worked by dependent farmers in exchange for protection and tax remission. This network of landholding tied loyalty directly to the monarchy and ensured a steady agricultural surplus for the state's granaries. The commoners, or haparu, formed the productive base of the kingdom. Most were free subjects who farmed small plots, herded livestock, and provided seasonal labor to royal or temple lands. Legal tablets indicate their obligations were measured in grain or livestock rather than coinage, reflecting a subsistence economy regulated through redistribution. Village councils administered local affairs under royal oversight, and standardized weights suggest a monitored system of barter and exchange. Archaeobotanical studies from sites such as Alacahoyuk and Sapinua reveal a mixed economy of wheat, barley, and lentils, supported by sheep and cattle herding. Artisans occupied a distinct social niche. Workshops near royal and temple complexes produced pottery, tools, jewelry, and bronze weaponry. The metallurgical skill of Anatolia was renowned. Hittite smiths exploited rich deposits of copper, silver, and lead, and by the 14th century BCE had begun working with iron, though its use remained limited to ceremonial or elite contexts. Seal impressions found on workshop debris show that craft production was registered and taxed by the state, evidence of early industrial regulation. Women's roles in Hittite society, documented through both law codes and palace correspondence, were varied and comparatively visible. The Tawanana held ceremonial precedence, while noblewomen could own property, manage estates, and issue contracts. Legal records confirm women's rights in divorce and inheritance, and their responsibility for household economies. In rural communities, women managed food storage, textile production, and animal care, functions vital to the stability of agrarian life. Priestesses and temple attendants likewise occupied institutional positions, sustaining cultic rituals that reinforced political legitimacy. Domestic life, as reconstructed from house plans in provincial sites, centered on rectangular mud-brick dwellings organized around courtyards. Hearths, grinding stones, and storage jars indicate a rhythm of daily activity tied to agriculture and seasonal cycles. Bread ovens and loom weights suggest that most households produced their own food and textiles, integrating family economy with local exchange. Burials beneath house floors, a common practice, indicate both ancestral veneration and property continuity, linking generations to a single plot of land. Education and literacy remained largely confined to scribal families, though administrative records show that even minor officials could read basic formulae. Festivals and public rituals, however, disseminated state ideology to the broader population. The Purulli festival, celebrating spring renewal, and the great processions at Yazilikaya, where the gods of Hutti and Huri marched in relief, reaffirmed collective identity. Such gatherings also functioned as markets and legal assemblies, blending religious, social, and economic interaction. Artistic expression reflected the same fusion of practicality and devotion. Reliefs carved into city gates at Alacahoyuk depict processions of priests and bulls, symbols of fertility and royal power. Small figurines, pottery decorations, and metal ornaments suggest a robust vernacular tradition of craftsmanship extending beyond the palace sphere. Architecture itself, with stone fortifications and multi-room houses, shows adaptation to Anatolia's harsh climate and seismic terrain. Interpretively, this structured yet flexible society demonstrates the adaptive strength of the Hittite system. Its hierarchy maintains stability without absolute rigidity. Women's agency and communal governance reveal mechanisms of resilience uncommon in strictly autocratic empires. The balance between local autonomy and central oversight allowed Hutti to integrate diverse ethnic and linguistic groups across Anatolia. Prosperity, however, always depended on control of trade and war. The empire's true power lay not in bronze, but in barley. At the heart of the Hittite Empire's endurance was not its army or diplomacy, but its mastery of land and labor. In the rugged uplands of central Anatolia, where rainfall was uneven and soil thin, the Hittites constructed an agricultural system capable of sustaining both population and army for centuries. Archaeological surveys, cuneiform tablets, and paleo-environmental studies reveal how they transformed a challenging landscape into a stable economic base, a feat of coordination that made imperial expansion possible. The Hittite heartland, the Halys Basin, offered limited arable soil but abundant natural fortifications and seasonal watercourses. The state's agricultural policy was designed around these constraints. Royal land grants, recorded in legal documents and edicts, distributed plots to military officers, priests, and provincial governors in exchange for service and tribute. The manna, royal estate, system allowed the crown to maintain direct control over productive land, while local farmers cultivated these holdings under obligation to deliver grain and livestock to state granaries. Excavations at Hattusa and nearby sites have revealed vast storage facilities with stone-lined silos and clay jar repositories, evidence of centralized collection and redistribution. Agriculture in Hutti was diversified for resilience. Barley and emmer wheat dominated cultivation, supported by lentils, flax, and chickpeas. Crop remains from Alacahoyuk and Bucklakale indicate intercropping practices designed to maintain soil fertility. Bronze Age plows and sickles unearthed in rural settlements suggest that smallholder farms used animal traction for tillage, and seasonal labor was mobilized through corvée obligations. Agricultural cycles were carefully synchronized with religious festivals that invoked deities for rain and fertility, a ritual reflection of economic necessity. Water management was a defining feature of Hittite resource planning. The highlands lacked major rivers, but numerous small springs were harnessed through artificial reservoirs and channels. One of the most striking examples is the Yenis Reservoir near Alacahoyuk, dating to the 14th century BCE. Built with stone embankments and sluice systems, it reflects early state involvement in hydraulic engineering. Inscriptions describe offerings to storm gods before irrigation works, underscoring the integration of environmental management with religious oversight. These reservoirs ensured stable grain yields, supporting not only local populations but also the provisioning of armies and urban centers. Forestry and livestock management further diversified the economy. The oak and pine forests surrounding Hattusa supplied timber for construction and chariot production, while cattle, sheep, and goats formed the basis of secondary industries, leather, wool, and dairy. Herds were counted and taxed, with periodic inspections recorded in provincial archives. The state's concern with resource control is also evident in edicts regulating pasture rights and the rotation of grazing lands. Archaeozoological evidence from Bagaskoi shows that oxen and donkeys were essential draft animals, reflecting the agrarian character of Hittite infrastructure. The administration of these resources was as complex as the physical system itself. Bureaucrats maintained tablet archives that recorded grain distributions, temple offerings, and corvée labor quotas. Standardized measures, such as the GUR, 4-volume, and GIN, 4-weight, facilitated accountability across the empire's provinces. The king, as supreme landlord, received reports through a chain of officials who oversaw estate production and coordinated the transport of surplus to royal centers. This logistical framework enabled the state to store reserves against famine and to supply distant garrisons, a critical factor in sustaining campaigns as far as Syria. Interpretively, this integration of environmental adaptation and bureaucratic oversight exemplifies the pragmatic intelligence of the Hittite state. Rather than imposing a uniform agrarian system, the empire adjusted to the ecological diversity of Anatolia, terrace farming in the mountains, irrigation in valleys, and dry farming on the plateau. The result was a distributed economy resilient to local failure, yet bound together by centralized control and redistribution. Economic tablets from the reign of Tudhaliya IV record the regulation of seed distribution and temple lands, showing a late-stage sophistication in agricultural accounting. These sources also suggest an emerging awareness of ecological limits. Edicts warn against overgrazing and require the restoration of fallow land. Such evidence places the Hittites among the earliest documented states to institutionalize environmental management within royal policy. In practice, agriculture was more than subsistence. It was the foundation of the imperial contract. Every temple feast, military expedition, and construction project relied on the invisible labor of cultivators who worked under the supervision of palace officials and tax collectors. The reliability of this agrarian system determined the stability of the throne itself. Yet wealth also flowed along the caravan roads of Anatolia. From the mountains of Anatolia to the harbors of the Levant, Hittite goods traveled far. Across the 13th century BCE, the Hittite Empire stood at the crossroads of the late Bronze Age economy. From its highland capital at Hattusa, routes fanned outward toward the Black Sea, the Aegean, and the rich Levantine ports of Ugarit and Byblos. Through these arteries flowed copper, tin, textiles, and grain, commodities that bound Anatolia to a global system of exchange stretching from Mycenaean Greece to the palaces of Mesopotamia. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals that Hutti's prosperity rested as much on commerce as on conquest. Anatolia's geography defined the network. The royal road system, maintained since the Old Kingdom, connected inland cities such as Kadesh, Hattusa, and Kizzuwatna to southern markets in Cilicia and northern Syria. These routes followed mountain passes and river valleys, secured by fortresses and caravanserais. Merchants moved in organized caravans, their goods recorded on cuneiform tablets that detailed transport, ownership, and customs duties. Hittite officials monitored each stage, ensuring that trade also served administrative oversight. The rediscovery of seals and tablets at Bagaskoi and Alalak confirms the extent of this commercial bureaucracy. The empire's most valuable exchanges involved metals. Anatolia was rich in copper, silver, and lead, but tin, essential for bronze production, had to be imported. The archives of Canes, ancient Kultepe, from earlier Assyrian colonies already document the import of tin from the east and its redistribution westward. By the Great Kingdom period, Hittite control over central routes allowed the state to tax and regulate this flow. In return, Anatolian copper and finished bronze goods traveled south toward the Levant and Egypt. This metallurgical trade was vital to sustaining military and agricultural tools, the material foundation of imperial life. The maritime dimension of this economy is vividly illustrated by the Ulubran shipwreck, discovered off the Turkish coast and dated to the late 14th century BCE. Though not directly Hittite, its cargo, 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, tin, glass, ivory, and luxury goods, reflects the same networks that linked Anatolia with Cyprus, Alatia, the Aegean, and the Levant. Tablets from Ugarit, a Hittite vassal port, mention shipments of copper and wood to Hutti, as well as the exchange of silver and textiles in return. These archives demonstrate a controlled flow of commodities, managed through treaties and royal agents who guaranteed trade privileges for loyal ports. Cyprus played a particularly important role. As the principal copper supplier of the eastern Mediterranean, its trade was monitored closely by Hittite kings. Correspondence between the Hittite court and the ruler of Alatia, preserved in Akkadian, records both diplomatic courtesies and complaints over delayed shipments. The control of this copper network ensured the empire's capacity to produce weapons and tribute goods, essential markers of status in the late Bronze Age world. The Hittites also participated in the textile trade, another key component of the regional economy. Wool and linen garments from Anatolia were prized in Syria and Mesopotamia. Records from Hattusa list temple workshops staffed by women weavers who produced standardized textiles for export and for use in diplomatic gifts. The combination of state-managed and private production shows that commercial exchange functioned under both religious and royal supervision. To the west, contact with the Aegean world is attested through Mycenaean pottery found in western Anatolia and through Hittite references to Ahiawa, a term generally associated with Mycenaean Greeks. These interactions were not purely military. The presence of Aegean-style goods in Hittite-controlled territories indicates trade alongside occasional conflict. Shipments of oil, wine, and fine ceramics moved along the western coast, reaching inland via overland routes maintained by vassal states. Interpretively, the Hittite role in this network illustrates their dual identity as both continental and maritime power brokers. Their inland position required careful management of corridors linking disparate ecological zones, metal-producing highlands, grain fields of the interior, and coastal entrepôts under imperial protection. Through this integration, the Hittites acted as mediators between Eastern and Western economies, their archives serving as the administrative memory of a connected Bronze Age world. Textual evidence from Ugarit and Hattusa underscores the economic diplomacy that underpinned these exchanges. Treaties stipulated trade rights, fixed prices, and designated safe routes. Merchant caravans were protected by royal guarantees, and disputes were settled through written arbitration. Such regulation demonstrates the bureaucratic sophistication of Hittite economic policy, where commerce was both a fiscal engine and a tool of political control. By the 13th century BCE, Hutti had become indispensable to the flow of goods across the eastern Mediterranean. Its ports supplied Egypt with timber and horses, while inland workshops produced finished bronzes and textiles for redistribution. The empire's wealth thus rested on its ability to supervise trade, not merely as participant but as regulator of passage between continents. Such wealth demanded protection and diplomacy. Power was preserved not only by armies but by clauses and seals. While Hittite armies enforced dominion through conquest, it was paperwork, or more precisely, claywork, that sustained it. The empire's real architecture of control lay in its treaties, correspondence, and archives, instruments through which kings transformed raw power into enduring order. In an age where oaths were sacred and divine witnesses stood beside human rulers, diplomacy was theology written in cuneiform. At the heart of this system stood the treaty, a distinctly Hittite contribution to international politics. Each was a masterpiece of formality and structure, consistent, hierarchical, and legalistic. The prologue invoked the great deeds of the Hittite king, reminding the vassal of the benefits of Hittite protection. Next came the stipulations, laying out precise obligations: tribute, military aid, non-aggression, and loyalty to the royal house. The gods of both nations were then called to witness, followed by curses and blessings, divine sanctions guaranteeing compliance. Finally, both copies were sealed, one dispatched to the vassal, the other deposited in Hattusa's archives beneath the watchful eyes of the gods. Through this bureaucratic ritual, the Hittites bound dozens of client states, from Ugarit on the Syrian coast to Kizzuwatna in southern Anatolia and Amurru in the Levant. These treaties often bore a personal tone. The Hittite king addressed his counterpart as brother or son, signaling a graded hierarchy of equals and subordinates. Vassals swore fealty in the names of the storm god and the sun goddess, binding not only themselves but their descendants. Disobedience, according to the curse clauses, would bring famine, disease, and the wrath of the heavens. The most famous of these diplomatic texts is the Treaty of Kadesh, concluded between Ramesses II of Egypt and Hattusa III around 1259 BCE, the earliest known peace treaty in world history. Written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of diplomacy, it formalized an end to decades of conflict. The treaty promised mutual defense and the extradition of fugitives, ensuring stability across the Near East. Copies survive in both Hittite and Egyptian archives, their nearly identical wording a testament to the shared norms of late Bronze Age diplomacy. Beneath its legal phrasing lay an implicit admission: the Hittites had achieved parity with Egypt, the other great superpower of their age. Such documents were the lifeblood of the imperial bureaucracy. The archives at Hattusa, discovered in the early 20th century, contained over 30,000 clay tablets, a treasury of laws, treaties, prayers, and administrative records. Within their standardized formats, one can trace the routines of government, grain allocations, troop rosters, tax assessments, and temple inventories. Scribes trained in Akkadian and Hittite maintained this record-keeping system, ensuring continuity across reigns. Their education, often within temple schools, made them both bureaucrats and historians, preserving the empire's logic through careful transcription. This administrative machinery was not merely passive record-keeping. It actively shaped how power functioned. Governors and viceroys of frontier regions, especially in Syria and Anatolia's borderlands, operated within a framework of correspondence and regular reporting. Orders from the great king moved swiftly along relay routes. Responses were archived and cross-referenced. Even in distant provinces, the royal seal carried authority as binding as an army. The Hittites also innovated in the management of succession and regency, using formal edicts to codify power transitions. One notable example, the Apology of Hattusa III, blends autobiography, legal defense, and divine justification. In it, the king recounts how he overthrew his nephew to restore order, legitimizing his rule through divine sanction and moral rhetoric. The text exemplifies how written argument, not just force, could consolidate authority. Diplomacy extended beyond mere subjugation. Through treaties, the Hittite kings wove a network of mutual dependency, in which loyalty was reinforced by trade, marriage alliances, and shared ritual. Foreign princesses entered the Hittite court as royal consorts. In return, Hutti sent gifts of horses, gold, and crafted goods. The tone of these letters, preserved in the Amarna correspondence and Hittite archives, reveals an international elite who communicated through ritualized politeness, even as they maneuvered for power. In practice, this diplomatic system served two purposes. It allowed the Hittites to maintain control over distant lands with limited military presence, and it projected the image of divine order, a cosmic hierarchy mirrored in the political world. Every treaty, every seal, reinforced the idea that the king of Hutti ruled by divine mandate, upholding balance between gods, men, and nations. Yet beneath this facade of legal order, tension brewed. The same bureaucracy that bound the empire together could not prevent its unraveling. Vassals grew restless, correspondence slowed, and archives fell silent as war and famine spread across the late Bronze Age world. But the stability of empire would soon be tested on the battlefield. Iron and horse sinew forged the edge of Hittite power. The Hittite Empire did not endure through diplomacy alone. Behind the treaties and tablets stood the army of Hutti, disciplined, inventive, and grounded in the rugged geography of Anatolia. From its earliest kings to the zenith of Sepululima and Muwatalli, the Hittite military evolved from tribal levies into one of the most formidable forces of the late Bronze Age. It was not the vastness of their numbers that made them formidable, but the precision of their machines and the logic of their command, a system built on logistics, specialization, and divine sanction. The foundation of Hittite warfare lay in the organization of the royal army, or Karuli. At its core were the retainers of the great king, professional soldiers drawn from noble families and bound by oaths of loyalty. Surrounding them were provincial levies, raised from the agricultural population during campaigns, commanded by local lords who owed military service as part of their land grants. Each vassal state contributed troops according to treaty obligations, creating a multi-ethnic coalition of Anatolian, Syrian, and Hurrian contingents. Such a system demanded strict coordination, and the king's scribes recorded every conscription, ration, and march in cuneiform. Archaeological remains from Hattusa, Alacahoyuk, and Bagaskoy reveal the scale of their military infrastructure. Storehouses filled with grain, arsenals stocked with bronze-tipped spears and arrows, and defensive walls engineered with stone casemates and wooden ramparts. Fortifications followed a distinct design, bastioned gates, sloped glacis, and concealed sally ports, built as much for ceremony as for defense. Each gate bore a name invoking the gods, transforming the city's perimeter into a sacred boundary between chaos and order. But the Hittites' true military hallmark was their chariotry. In the Bronze Age, the chariot was the tank, the swift engine of power that carried kings to glory. Earlier Near Eastern powers, such as the Egyptians and Mitanni, favored light, two-man chariots optimized for speed and archery. The Hittites, however, engineered a heavier, three-man design, one driver, one shield-bearer, and one spearman, trading agility for stability and striking force. This innovation allowed them to crash through enemy formations rather than simply circle and harass. The chariot corps, Marianu, became the empire's elite arm, trained in precision maneuvers and supported by specialized workshops that maintained horses, harnesses, and spare parts. Texts such as the Annals of Mursalai II describe elaborate preparations for campaigns. Divinations before departure, stockpiling of chariot wheels and horse fodder, and the ritual purification of soldiers. Horses themselves were revered, symbols of royal legitimacy and divine favor. The Kikili texts, a remarkable manual written by a Mitannian horse trainer in Hittite service, detail advanced methods of conditioning war horses through interval training and careful feeding cycles. These instructions, over 3 millennia old, remain among the earliest known examples of systematic athletic training. The army's tactics reflected this blend of discipline and devotion. Infantry formed dense spear lines supported by archers, advancing behind the shock of chariots. Commanders, often royal princes, coordinated via messengers and signal fires, ensuring synchronization across rough terrain. Unlike the open plains of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Anatolia's mountains demanded adaptive warfare, ambushes, sieges, and logistical endurance. Campaigns could last months, with columns moving through winding passes and fortified supply depots ensuring sustenance. At the center of this military machine was the king as general, the embodiment of divine authority on the battlefield. Hittite kings rarely delegated major campaigns. Annals record their presence at every decisive conflict. Before battle, rituals invoked the storm god of Hutti and the sun goddess of Irina, seeking omens of victory. Victory was not merely political but cosmic, reaffirming the balance between gods and men. Defeat, conversely, demanded ritual atonement and purification, as seen in Mursalai II's lamentations after plague struck his army. Weapons and armor complemented the chariot's dominance. Soldiers wielded bronze spears, short swords, and composite bows, all forged in royal workshops. There is evidence of early iron experimentation, especially in ceremonial blades, giving the Hittites a symbolic connection to the future age of iron. Shields bore bronze bosses and leather coverings, while officers distinguished themselves by crested helmets and ornate belts. The discipline of metallurgy, combining copper, tin, and occasionally iron, was central to the empire's identity, both practical and mythic. The logistics of war were equally sophisticated. Hittite campaigns required vast amounts of grain, fodder, and bronze, all drawn from state-controlled storehouses. Royal edicts specify quotas for local governors, ensuring that supply chains remained steady across Anatolia's rugged interior. Caravans carried provisions to forward bases, and scribes kept meticulous inventories. When the king marched, the entire state moved with him: priests, diviners, craftsmen, and heralds. War was not chaos but a process, managed through tablets and rituals as much as through blood and steel. Hittite military ideology also emphasized restraint and restoration rather than annihilation. Conquered cities were often reintegrated as vassal states, their gods invited into the Hittite pantheon, their rulers bound by oath. This policy of controlled conquest reflected both pragmatism and theology. The aim was to expand divine order, not sow destruction. By the time of Muwatalli II in the 13th century BCE, the Hittite army had become a trans-regional force capable of confronting Egypt's might at Kadesh, the largest chariot battle ever recorded. The encounter would define not only the limits of Hittite expansion but also the beginning of a new diplomatic era. Their mastery of arms carried them to the gates of Kadesh. On the banks of the Orontes, two great kings met in history's first recorded clash of superpowers. By the late 13th century BCE, the Hittite and Egyptian empires stood as the twin pillars of the late Bronze Age world. Between them lay the wealthy lands of northern Syria, Amurru, Upi, and Kadesh, territories whose strategic and economic value made them perpetual zones of contention. To the Egyptians, these provinces represented lost dominions of earlier pharaohs. To the Hittites, they were the hard-won fruits of Suppilulima's conquests. When Muwatalli II of Hutti and Ramesses II of Egypt ascended their respective thrones, the confrontation became inevitable. The Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE on the banks of the Orontes River, marks the first major battle in recorded history for which both sides left extensive written accounts. Egyptian hieroglyphic reliefs, notably the poem of Pentuer and the Bulletin, were carved upon temple walls from Abu Simbel to Luxor, proclaiming Ramesses' divine heroism. On the Hittite side, fewer records survive, but fragments of diplomatic correspondence and annalistic summaries from Hattusa allow modern historians to reconstruct the campaign from both perspectives. Together, they present a rare double lens on late Bronze Age statecraft, propaganda, and warfare. Muwatalli II, having transferred his capital southward to Tarhantassa, aimed to secure Hutti's southern frontier and maintain control over Syria's vassal states. Egypt's resurgence under Ramesses II threatened this arrangement. In the 5th year of his reign, Ramesses led a large force, estimated in inscriptions at 4 divisions of roughly 5,000 men each northward through Canaan. The Hittites, meanwhile, assembled a coalition of allies drawn from nearly 20 subject kingdoms, including Aleppo, Carchemish, Arzua, and Dardania. Contemporary tablets emphasize the coordination required to muster such a confederation, underscoring Hutti's diplomatic reach. Egyptian records claim that Ramesses advanced rapidly, divided into 4 divisions named after the gods Ammonius, Ra, Ta, and Seth. The Hittite army, already encamped behind Kadesh's fortified walls, prepared an elaborate ambush. A pair of captured spies, Hittite agents posing as deserters, convinced Ramesses that Muwatalli was still far to the north. Deceived by this misinformation, the Egyptian pharaoh pressed forward with only the Ammonius division near his camp, leaving the others scattered along the road. Modern scholars identify this moment as one of the most sophisticated instances of ancient military deception. Cuneiform fragments from Hattusa confirm Hittite knowledge of Egyptian movements and timing, suggesting a well-organized intelligence network. The trap was set. As Ramesses' camp was being established, thousands of Hittite chariots surged across the Orontes, descending upon the Egyptian position. According to the poem of Pentuer, the Hittite chariots struck the unprepared Egyptian camp in a sudden, coordinated assault. The Egyptian lines broke. Disorder spread through the Ammonius division. Ramesses' own chariot nearly fell to the enemy, and his personal valor, heavily dramatized in Egyptian sources, was portrayed as turning the tide. Hittite accounts, however, imply a much less decisive result. The Hittite forces looted the camp but were soon counterattacked by the regrouped Egyptian reserves and the timely arrival of the Nearan, a contingent possibly drawn from Egyptian-controlled Canaanite territories. Archaeological evidence, particularly from the Orontes Basin and sites such as Tel Nebi Mend, believed to overlay ancient Kadesh, supports a mixed outcome. No layer of large-scale destruction corresponds to the battle, suggesting neither empire captured the city permanently. Both armies suffered heavy losses, and neither achieved strategic dominance. The battle stands as the largest recorded chariot engagement in antiquity, involving perhaps 4,000 to 6,000 vehicles. The Hittite chariots, heavier and designed for impact, initially outmaneuvered the Egyptian lighter models. However, their weight and slower maneuverability made them vulnerable once Egyptian reinforcements stabilized the line. This dynamic illustrates a fundamental contrast in military doctrine. The Hittites favored concentrated shock tactics, while the Egyptians relied on flexibility and archery support. Inscriptions describe the field as chaotic, crowded with broken chariots and panicked horses. The terrain around Kadesh, a broad plain bounded by the Orontes and a ridge of hills, favored ambush but limited sustained pursuit. Both commanders faced logistical constraints: extended supply lines, intense heat, and dependence on river crossings. The endurance of their respective armies after such losses reflects the administrative sophistication of both states. The aftermath of Kadesh was as much political as military. Ramesses II declared total victory, commissioning temple reliefs that depicted the Hittite forces routed and the pharaoh triumphant under the gaze of Ammonius. These inscriptions were not reports but state propaganda, reinforcing the divine legitimacy of the pharaoh's rule. The Hittite archives, now fragmentary, suggest a more pragmatic assessment. The battle ended in stalemate, preserving the Hittite position in Syria. Historians interpret the differing narratives as evidence of the ideological priorities of both empires. For Egypt, victory affirmed divine kingship. For Hutti, survival against Egypt's might validated the balance of power. The outcome maintained the status quo, but the cost of maintaining frontiers across Syria and Anatolia strained both empires' resources. Following Kadesh, Muwatalli II retained control over Kadesh and Amurru, effectively containing Egyptian expansion northward. However, internal tensions within the Hittite royal line soon emerged. Upon Muwatalli's death, disputes between his sons and his brother Hattusili would plunge the empire into dynastic instability. Yet, the lessons of Kadesh endured. Both states recognized that prolonged conflict yielded diminishing returns. Within 2 decades, the successors of these rulers, Hattusili III of Hutti and Ramesses II of Egypt, would negotiate the Treaty of Kadesh, the earliest known surviving international peace treaty. Inscribed in both Akkadian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs, it formalized borders, mutual non-aggression, and extradition clauses, a diplomatic framework that shaped the late Bronze Age's political landscape. Interpretive insights. The Battle of Kadesh represents a turning point in international relations, marking the transition from conquest-driven expansion to codified diplomacy. It illustrates the limits of late Bronze Age imperial logistics. The difficulty of projecting power across distant frontiers defined the equilibrium of the age. The event underscores the propagandistic nature of ancient history, where victory was as much a narrative construct as a military reality. The outcome led not to conquest, but to diplomacy. Where swords failed, tablets endured. In the aftermath of decades of rivalry, two of the ancient world's greatest powers, Hittite and Egypt, chose to enshrine peace not through conquest, but through writing. Around 1259 BCE, under Hattusa III of the Hittite Empire and Ramesses II of Egypt, a diplomatic accord was concluded that remains one of humanity's earliest surviving examples of a formal peace treaty. Known to historians as the Treaty of Kadesh, this document stands as a testament to the political maturity and legal sophistication of the late Bronze Age world. The agreement survives in two primary versions: a cuneiform text discovered in the archives of Hattusa, and a hieroglyphic version engraved on the walls of Karnak and the Ramesseum in Egypt. Both copies, though written in the languages and styles of their respective cultures, express identical terms, a remarkable demonstration of mutual recognition between two sovereign states. The Akkadian language tablet from Hattusa, now preserved in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, is inscribed with diplomatic precision, establishing a precedent for international law and treaty protocol. The treaty opens with formal declarations of peace and brotherhood between the great king of Hittite, Hattusa, the hero, and the great king of Egypt, Ramesses, the great ruler. Each monarch acknowledges the other's legitimacy, ending decades of hostilities that had destabilized Syria. Its clauses include a mutual non-aggression pact, a military alliance clause promising mutual defense against external threats, and extradition provisions requiring the return of fugitives or defectors between the two realms. These measures reveal not only a concern for military stability but also for administrative and population control across shared borders. One clause, preserved with particular clarity, emphasizes the moral dimension of this accord. As for these words of silver that the great king, the king of Hittite, and the great king, the king of Egypt, have made with one another, they shall remain in good peace and in good brotherhood forever. The term words of silver metaphorically equates the treaty to a precious bond of trust, suggesting that diplomacy itself was viewed as a sacred exchange. Divine witnesses, the gods of both nations, were invoked to guarantee the pact's endurance. This treaty also marks a key institutional innovation: the use of duplicated standardized texts held by both sides. It reflects the administrative sophistication of Hittite and Egyptian chancelleries, which maintained parallel archives, translators, and seal-bearers. The presence of bilingual correspondence and scribal consistency across distant capitals underscores the high degree of cultural exchange within the late Bronze Age's international system, often referred to by scholars as the Club of Great Powers. In practical terms, the peace held for the remainder of both rulers' reigns, stabilizing trade routes and ensuring a sustained flow of goods, envoys, and royal correspondence between Anatolia and the Nile Valley. The treaty's symbolic importance, however, extends beyond its immediate political effects. It represents one of the earliest known articulations of sovereign equality, a recognition that even rival empires could coexist under mutually binding law. The original cuneiform copy, rediscovered at Bagaskoi in the early 20th century, and the Egyptian reliefs that mirror its contents, have become emblematic of early diplomacy. A modern reproduction now stands at the United Nations headquarters in New York, symbolizing humanity's long pursuit of peace through written accord. Interpretive insights. The Treaty of Kadesh codified principles later fundamental to diplomacy, mutual recognition, legal parity, and the binding nature of oaths. Its survival in two distinct cultural forms demonstrates the shared diplomatic language of the late Bronze Age world. The inclusion of divine witnesses underscores how religion and politics merged to enforce moral order among kings. Yet peace abroad could not prevent storms within. A usurper turned diplomat restored calm to a weary empire. The accession of Hattusa III, circa 1267 to 1237 BCE, followed a period of dynastic turmoil in Hittite, illustrating the delicate interplay between familial politics, military authority, and divine sanction. He was the younger brother of Muwatalli II and had previously served as a provincial governor and military commander. Upon his brother's death, succession disputes erupted between Hattusili and Muwatalli's sons, reflecting the vulnerabilities inherent in a system of hereditary kingship that lacked a fully codified primogeniture. The Apology of Hattusili III, a self-justifying document preserved in cuneiform, recounts the events with precision, emphasizing his actions as both legitimate and divinely sanctioned. It demonstrates how Hittite kings framed internal conflict not as mere power grabs but as restoration of cosmic and political order. Hattusili's consolidation of power relied on pragmatic diplomacy and administrative control. He first secured loyalty among key military commanders, provincial governors, and temple officials, reaffirming the central authority of Hattusa. Scribes recorded royal edicts ordering tribute collection, mobilization of troops, and the redistribution of lands to loyal subjects. This bureaucratic oversight, previously emphasized by kings like Mursalai II, became essential in a kingdom recovering from decades of warfare and frontier instability. By formalizing procedures for communication, taxation, and legal adjudication, Hattusili reinforced continuity while preventing the resurgence of factional rivalries. Equally significant was Hattusili's diplomatic engagement with Egypt, a relationship shaped by the legacy of the Battle of Kadesh. He maintained a personal correspondence with Ramesses II, codified in cuneiform letters, discussing matters ranging from vassal loyalty to marriage alliances. Hattusili's negotiation skills not only preserved peace but enhanced Hutti's prestige. By framing the Hittite king as an equal participant in treaty discourse, he solidified the empire's position within the late Bronze Age international system. These communications exemplify the dual role of the Hittite monarch, warrior in the field and arbiter in diplomacy. Hattusili also strengthened internal religious authority to legitimize his rule. He emphasized the role of the storm god of Hutti and the sun goddess of Irina in sanctioning kingship, commissioning temples and ritual texts that reinforced his divine mandate. This strategy reflected a broader Hittite understanding. Political stability and religious observance were inseparable. By aligning bureaucratic reforms with religious ritual, Hattusili created a framework in which dissent could be addressed through both legal and moral channels. Administrative reforms extended to the management of vassal states. Treaties and oaths were reaffirmed, and officials monitored the collection of tribute and military levies. In Syria, governors were instructed to report troop movements and maintain supply lines to Hattusa, ensuring that the empire's southern frontier remained defensible without necessitating a permanent army in every province. This careful balance of central oversight and local autonomy demonstrated Hattusili's understanding of sustainable imperial governance. Economic consolidation accompanied political stabilization. Hattusili oversaw the regulation of trade networks, particularly copper, tin, and luxury goods essential to both domestic workshops and diplomatic gift exchanges. Archives from Hattusa indicate continued monitoring of vassal contributions and merchant activities, confirming that economic integration remained a tool of imperial cohesion. The alignment of bureaucracy, religion, and economy under Hattusili's rule exemplifies the empire at its organizational apex. Despite these successes, the period was not without tension. Chroniclers note localized revolts and challenges from rival claimants, highlighting the underlying strain of overextension. Hattusili mitigated these threats through a combination of legal precedent, ritual sanction, and selective military action. His reign demonstrates how internal consolidation can complement external diplomacy, allowing an empire to maintain authority while navigating the complex dynamics of succession, vassal loyalty, and frontier management. But beneath order lay the strains of overreach. In the heart of Hattusa, a queen governed alongside her king. The reign of Hattusili III was closely intertwined with that of his queen, Pujahipa, whose influence reshaped both religious and political life in the Hittite Empire. Originally a priestess of the goddess Ishtar of Irina, Pujahipa leveraged her religious authority to become an indispensable partner in governance, illustrating the unique role of queenship in Hutti. Her position was not ceremonial. She wielded tangible power in diplomacy, administration, and the orchestration of religious reforms. Pujahipa's religious authority was central to her influence. She oversaw temple construction and priestly appointments, codifying rituals and offering guidance on divinatory practices. By aligning herself with the storm god of Hutti and the sun goddess of Irina, she reinforced the divine legitimacy of her husband's rule while simultaneously shaping the ideological framework of the court. Texts attribute to her the creation of prayers, hymns, and ritual protocols that standardized worship practices across the empire, consolidating religious unity at a time when political stability remained fragile. Her role extended into administrative governance. Cuneiform tablets reveal that Pujahipa issued decrees, mediated disputes, and directed certain provincial affairs, particularly concerning women, temples, and vassal territories. In some instances, her name appears alongside Hattusili's on official correspondence, underscoring the co-regency model that allowed her to exercise authority in areas of expertise. This administrative visibility was unusual for the Late Bronze Age and demonstrates the Hittite system's flexibility in integrating capable individuals into governance structures, irrespective of gender. Pujahipa also played a diplomatic role of remarkable sophistication. She corresponded with foreign rulers, most notably the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II, sending letters that combined protocol, negotiation, and familial appeals. Her diplomatic letters reveal careful attention to tone, hierarchy, and precedent, illustrating that queens could serve as conduits for both soft power and alliance management. These communications included discussions of marriage alliances, vassal obligations, and the status of captured territories, positioning her as a key actor in the maintenance of international stability. Her influence extended to legal and social reforms within Hattusa. Pujahipa worked alongside scribes to clarify succession practices, regulate temple property, and oversee disputes involving land and inheritance. By participating in these administrative processes, she helped to codify and enforce laws that had lasting effects on the empire's bureaucratic continuity. In particular, her reforms strengthened the position of women in the religious sphere, providing a model of sanctioned female authority within a patriarchal society. Archaeological evidence supports her active presence at Hattusa. Reliefs from the Yazilikaya sanctuary depict the queen in proximity to the storm god and other deities, visually asserting her dual role as religious intermediary and political partner. These inscriptions, along with cuneiform letters and administrative texts, provide a multifaceted view of her authority. She was simultaneously priest, advisor, diplomat, and queen, seamlessly bridging the sacred and the secular. Pujahipa's example underscores the interdependence of kingship and queenship in Hutti. While Hattusili III managed military and political strategy, Pujahipa stabilized internal governance and extended Hutti's influence through religious authority and diplomacy. Her presence highlights the systemic advantage of integrated leadership, demonstrating how the Late Bronze Age empire relied not only on kingship, but also on capable partners to sustain administrative cohesion and ideological legitimacy. Pujahipa's role illustrates the potential of queenship as a political and religious instrument, enhancing state capacity beyond conventional patriarchal norms. Her diplomatic correspondence emphasizes the importance of soft power, showing that influence could be exercised through negotiation, ritual, and ceremonial authority. The integration of religious, legal, and administrative duties under her supervision highlights the Hittite approach to systemic governance, where multiple actors contributed to imperial stability. Despite such capable rulers, external pressures mounted on every frontier. Each new fortress marked another strain on the empire's lifeblood. By the reign of Tudhaliya IV, circa 1237 to 1209 BCE, the Hittite Empire had reached its territorial zenith, encompassing vast stretches of Anatolia, northern Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia. The empire's expansion, while a testament to centuries of conquest and consolidation, revealed the structural limits of Late Bronze Age statecraft. The maintenance of distant provinces, the defense of extended frontiers, and the administration of a diverse population began to expose the vulnerabilities inherent in overextension. Tudhaliya IV continued campaigns in Tarhuntassa and the southern reaches of Anatolia, fortifying strategic locations with new citadels and military outposts. These efforts were designed to secure trade routes and buffer zones against nomadic incursions and rising powers in the region. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites, such as the citadels at Cirkeli Hoyuk and Hassler, indicates extensive use of stone bastions, defensive towers, and gate complexes, reflecting the empire's reliance on both engineering and manpower to maintain territorial integrity. However, the empire's military commitments came at a steep cost. Records indicate frequent levies of conscripted soldiers, requisitions of grain, and obligations from vassal states, placing significant strain on local economies. Cuneiform tablets from Hattusa detail labor quotas, tax arrears, and complaints from provincial governors, signs of administrative fatigue. The logistical challenges of supplying armies across mountainous Anatolia and war-torn Syrian plains were compounded by occasional crop failures, drought, and the pressures of supporting the royal court. External threats also intensified. Assyria, emerging as a regional power under kings such as Tukulti-Ninurta I, contested Hittite influence in northern Mesopotamia. Correspondence and annalistic texts describe skirmishes, territorial disputes, and negotiation attempts, suggesting that Tudhaliya IV faced a multipolar geopolitical environment where expansion created friction with neighboring states. Maintaining defensive lines along the Euphrates and Orontes required constant vigilance and diverted resources from internal development. In addition to military and diplomatic pressures, the Hittite administration struggled with succession disputes and internal factionalism. Evidence from palace archives reveals tension between royal family members, provincial governors, and priestly elites, highlighting the complex interplay of kinship, bureaucracy, and religious authority. Tudhaliya IV relied heavily on the counsel of his queen and senior officials to manage these tensions. Yet the empire's breadth increasingly outstripped the capacity of centralized oversight. The economic and social strains of imperial overreach were reflected in the redistribution of land and labor. Textual records describe the reassignment of estates to secure loyalty and fund military campaigns, while archaeological data from urban centers suggest population shifts and the construction of new fortifications at the expense of agricultural development. These pressures, accumulated over decades of expansion, reveal the systemic vulnerabilities that would later accelerate Hutti's decline. Despite these challenges, Tudhaliya IV's reign demonstrated the Hittites' enduring administrative competence. Bureaucrats maintained detailed records of tribute, trade, and military levies, while religious institutions continued to perform rituals legitimizing royal authority. Yet, the empire's structural limits were increasingly evident. Stretched borders, overtaxed populations, and a fracturing network of vassals created conditions in which external shocks could have catastrophic consequences. The twilight of Hutti had begun. Across the eastern Mediterranean, cities burned and records fell silent. By the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, the Hittite Empire confronted challenges that extended far beyond internal politics or isolated military threats. The Late Bronze Age collapse, a systemic upheaval affecting much of the eastern Mediterranean, created conditions of unprecedented instability. Archaeological evidence indicates that major urban centers, from Ugarit on the Syrian coast to Mycenaean Greece, experienced widespread destruction or abandonment. Hattusa itself exhibits a significant layer of debris corresponding to this period, marking the end of sustained monumental construction and indicating severe disruption of administrative continuity. Environmental stress appears to have played a significant role. Paleoclimatic data, including dendrochronology and sediment cores, suggest a series of prolonged droughts between 1250 and 1150 BCE across Anatolia and the Levant. Crop failures, reduced water availability, and soil degradation would have weakened local agrarian economies, limiting food surplus necessary to sustain armies, bureaucracies, and urban populations. Hittite records, though fragmentary, mention grain requisitions and famine relief, signaling that resource scarcity was already an acute concern before external pressures intensified. Trade disruptions compounded these environmental and economic challenges. The Hittite Empire relied on long-distance networks connecting Anatolia to Syria, Cyprus, and the Aegean. Excavations at Ulubran and other shipwreck sites reveal that the circulation of tin, copper, and luxury goods, critical for both military equipment and diplomatic exchange, declined sharply around 1200 BCE. Archaeologists note gaps in ceramic typologies, interruptions in standard weights, and a reduction in imported goods, suggesting that the commercial infrastructure underpinning Hutti's wealth was unraveling. The Sea Peoples phenomenon, recorded in Egyptian annals, introduced additional military and migratory pressures. While their exact identity remains debated, inscriptions from Ramesses III and earlier sources describe maritime raiders attacking coastal settlements and disrupting political networks. These attacks would have indirectly affected Hutti by destabilizing southern vassal states and blocking trade routes, forcing the empire to divert resources to frontier defense rather than internal administration or economic development. Internally, political fragmentation accelerated the decline. Following Tudhaliya IV, successive rulers struggled to maintain control over distant provinces, particularly in Syria and Tarhuntassa. Textual records from Hattusa, often terse and incomplete, indicate rising rebellions, uncollected tribute, and challenges from local elites. The previously effective combination of royal authority, religious sanction, and bureaucratic oversight could no longer compensate for environmental scarcity, trade collapse, and external military pressure. Archaeological evidence reinforces the systemic nature of this crisis. Excavations in Hattusa reveal burned structures, abandoned fortifications, and layers of refuse consistent with sudden depopulation. In the Levant, similar destruction layers appear contemporaneously, underscoring that Hutti's collapse was not an isolated event, but part of a wider regional catastrophe. Pottery styles abruptly changed, inscriptions ceased, and cuneiform archives became sparse, indicators that administrative networks had fractured. As the central power fell, fragments of Hittite culture survived elsewhere. Though the empire died, its language and gods lingered along the northern Levant. Following the collapse of central Hittite authority around c. 1200 BCE, the political landscape of Anatolia and northern Syria fragmented into a series of smaller polities collectively known as the Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states. These city kingdoms, including Carchemish, Melid, Kuma, Gergum, and Table, maintained varying degrees of autonomy while preserving many elements of Hittite culture, administration, and religious practice. Archaeological excavations, inscriptions, and monumental reliefs indicate that while imperial structures vanished, the underlying cultural and linguistic identity of Hutti endured for centuries. The city of Carchemish, strategically located on the Euphrates, became a central Neo-Hittite stronghold. Excavations reveal monumental gateways, temples, and royal inscriptions carved in Loian hieroglyphs, a descendant of the Hittite language. These texts often commemorate rulers' military exploits, temple dedications, and treaty arrangements with neighboring polities. The continued use of Loian hieroglyphic script demonstrates a deliberate effort to maintain administrative continuity, signaling both prestige and legitimacy in the absence of a central Hattusa-based authority. Other successor states, such as Melid, modern Malatya, followed a similar pattern. Kings styled themselves after the imperial Hittite model, using titles such as Great King and incorporating Hittite motifs into relief sculpture and ceremonial architecture. Temples dedicated to the storm god, sun goddess of Arena, and regional deities remained central to civic identity, revealing the persistence of religious networks as stabilizing institutions. Archaeologists have identified cultic practices, votive offerings, and sacred precincts that closely mirror those of imperial Hattusa, indicating that ritual continuity provided ideological cohesion even as political fragmentation deepened. The administrative and legal systems of these Neo-Hittite states retained several Hittite features. Inscriptions suggest that rulers maintained councils of elders, enforced local legal codes, and collected tribute from subordinate towns. While scaled to the capacities of smaller polities, these structures reflect a modular adaptation of imperial bureaucracy, preserving mechanisms of governance that had supported the larger Hittite Empire. Trade continued along the Euphrates, linking Neo-Hittite cities with Anatolia, Syria, and the Mediterranean, albeit at a reduced scale and with increased vulnerability to external pressures. Cultural production further illustrates continuity. Reliefs at sites such as Carchemish and Karatepe depict royal processions, military campaigns, and divine symbolism in styles derived from late Hittite imperial art. The use of hieroglyphic inscriptions alongside cuneiform tablets in certain regions demonstrates linguistic adaptation, reflecting both persistence and innovation. These artistic and epigraphic traditions allowed Neo-Hittite elites to assert authority, maintain social cohesion, and transmit Hittite heritage across generations. In addition, Neo-Hittite polities served as intermediaries in the emerging Iron Age world, bridging the gap between the late Bronze Age collapse and the rise of Assyrian dominance. While smaller in scale, they retained sufficient military and economic capacity to interact diplomatically with neighbors, participate in trade networks, and defend territorial claims. This continuity illustrates how cultural and institutional legacies can survive the collapse of centralized power, shaping subsequent regional history. These remnants carried Hittite heritage into the Iron Age. Buried for 3 millennia, Hattusa spoke again through clay. The memory of the Hittite Empire, lost to history for centuries, re-emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through systematic archaeological investigation. The site of Bagazkoy Hattusa, located in central Anatolia, became the focal point for uncovering the empire's political, religious, and administrative infrastructure. Excavations revealed monumental gates, royal palaces, temples, and extensive archives of cuneiform tablets, providing the first tangible evidence of Hittite civilization beyond classical references and biblical texts. The German archaeologist Hugo Winkler played a pivotal role in the initial rediscovery during excavations beginning in 1906. Winkler identified vast collections of clay tablets, many catalogued according to their find spots within the royal archives, which included administrative correspondence, treaties, and ritual texts. His meticulous recording of these artifacts laid the foundation for understanding Hattusa as the political and cultural heart of a sophisticated Bronze Age empire. Among these finds were treaties, annals, and diplomatic letters, including Hattusa III's correspondence with Ramesses II, revealing the intricate network of Hittite bureaucracy and international diplomacy. A major breakthrough came in 1915, when the Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný deciphered Hittite cuneiform, demonstrating that the language belonged to the Indo-European family. Hrozny's insight was grounded in grammatical analysis of key phrases, particularly ritual formulae invoking divine witnesses, and comparative study with known Indo-European languages. This discovery transformed Hittite studies from speculative history into a rigorously documented field, allowing scholars to read the empire's own records for the first time. Hittite kings, religious texts, and legal codes could now be analyzed directly, rather than inferred from external sources such as Egyptian or Assyrian inscriptions. Subsequent excavations throughout the 20th century expanded knowledge of Hattusa's urban planning, fortifications, and sacred landscape. Archaeologists identified city gates, including the Lion Gate and the Sphinx Gate, elaborately decorated with reliefs signaling royal authority and religious symbolism. The Assyria sanctuary provided insight into the Hittite pantheon, illustrating how art and ritual reinforced political legitimacy. Additionally, inscriptions found in Neo-Hittite sites, such as Carchemish and Melid, allowed scholars to trace the persistence of Hittite culture into the Iron Age. The rediscovery of Hattusa and its archives not only illuminated the structure of the Hittite Empire but also reshaped broader understandings of the late Bronze Age Near East. Scholars could now contextualize Hittite political history alongside contemporaneous Egypt, Assyria, and Mitanni, reconstructing diplomatic networks, trade relations, and military campaigns with unprecedented accuracy. Archaeological methodology, combined with philological analysis of cuneiform, revealed the empire's administrative sophistication, legal frameworks, and religious practices. Rediscovery gave rise to new debates over the Hittites' legacy. In the architecture of empire, the Hittites built a forgotten pillar. The Hittites occupy a unique position within the Late Bronze Age Near East, bridging the Anatolian highlands, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. Their political, legal, and religious institutions reveal a sophisticated synthesis of indigenous traditions and external influences, contributing to a broader understanding of Bronze Age statecraft. Comparative analysis demonstrates that Hittite innovations were both a continuation of older Near Eastern patterns and an adaptation to the specific demands of Anatolian geography and society. In the realm of law and governance, Hittite codes reflect a balance between codified regulations and pragmatic flexibility. Unlike the more rigidly formalized laws of Hammurabi's Babylon, Hittite legal texts combine statutory clauses with directives permitting royal discretion. Tablets such as those preserved in Hattusa provide evidence of detailed regulations on property, marriage, criminal offenses, and ritual obligations. Comparative study indicates that Hittite legal practice drew upon Mesopotamian precedents while adapting to the decentralized, multi-ethnic composition of the empire. This flexibility allowed for local variations in implementation, enabling governance across diverse Anatolian and Syrian regions. Diplomacy and international relations further highlight the Hittites' distinctive approach. The empire maintained intricate correspondence with Egypt, Mitanni, Assyria, and regional vassals, as exemplified in the Amarna letters and later treaties, including the historic accord with Ramesses II. These documents illustrate the Hittites' reliance on formalized agreements, oath-taking, and ceremonial gift exchanges as instruments of power. Compared to contemporaneous Egyptian diplomacy, Hittite practice emphasized legalistic codification, ensuring that obligations of vassals and allies were enforceable through both religious and political channels. Such methods influenced subsequent Near Eastern polities, establishing precedents for Iron Age treaty practice. The Hittite pantheon and mythology also reflect a comparative synthesis. Their polytheism incorporated indigenous Hattusa deities, Hurrian gods, and Mesopotamian influences, creating a flexible, multi-layered religious framework. Texts from Hattusa, such as ritual compilations and the Song of Kamarbi, reveal narrative structures, divine hierarchies, and mythic motifs that parallel Mesopotamian epics while introducing unique Anatolian elements. These stories informed later cultural traditions in the region, influencing Loian, Aramean, and even Hellenistic mythography. The syncretic nature of Hittite religion illustrates how empires adapted ideological systems to accommodate diverse populations while reinforcing political authority. Archaeological and textual evidence underscores Hutti's contributions to urban planning and monumental architecture. The design of Hattusa, with its fortified gates, citadels, and temple complexes, influenced subsequent Anatolian polities. Comparisons with Egyptian, Assyrian, and Mycenaean urban layouts highlight both shared Bronze Age principles and distinctive local adaptations to Anatolia's mountainous terrain. Such structural decisions were not merely aesthetic. They reinforced administrative control, military readiness, and ritual centrality, demonstrating the integration of civic, defensive, and religious functions. In comparative perspective, the Hittites also illuminate broader patterns of imperial rise and fall. Their trajectory, rapid expansion, bureaucratic consolidation, overextension, and eventual collapse mirror cycles observed in Mesopotamian city-states, Egyptian dynasties, and the Mycenaean kingdoms. Yet Hutti's adaptive legal systems, diplomatic innovation, and syncretic religion provided mechanisms for resilience, allowing fragments of culture to persist into the Neo-Hittite period and beyond. Such continuity offers modern scholars a case study in institutional persistence amid geopolitical instability. Modern research continues to refine this understanding. Each season of excavation redraws the map of ancient Anatolia. In the 21st century, archaeological investigation continues to transform our understanding of the Hittite Empire, revealing nuances in urban planning, administration, and cultural interaction that earlier excavations could only hint at. Key sites, including Bagaskoi Hattusa, Kasakli, and Kyalipinar, have been the focus of systematic digs, geophysical surveys, and stratigraphic analysis. These projects employ modern methodologies, digital mapping, remote sensing, and microarchaeological sampling to reconstruct both the material and social landscapes of Hutti with unprecedented precision. At Bagaskoy Hattusa, ongoing work has clarified the layout of royal complexes, temple precincts, and city fortifications. Excavators have documented previously overlooked structures, revealing patterns of urban zoning that distinguish administrative, residential, and religious functions. The use of 3D modeling and GIS mapping has allowed researchers to simulate movement within the city, providing insights into logistical and ceremonial organization. Similarly, Kasakli and Kyalipinar, regional centers on the empire's periphery, have yielded evidence of localized adaptation, including defensive architecture, craft production facilities, and inscriptions in Luwian hieroglyphs. These findings underscore the regional variability of Hittite urbanism while confirming a coherent imperial model. Digital analysis of the Hattusa cuneiform archives has advanced both philological and historical inquiry. Scholars now use high-resolution imaging and text recognition software to examine fragmented tablets, enabling the reconstruction of treaties, administrative correspondence, and ritual texts. Network analysis of these documents reveals patterns of communication between Hattusa and provincial centers, highlighting the empire's bureaucratic sophistication and the mechanisms by which authority was projected across Anatolia and northern Syria. This digital turn allows for quantitative approaches to historical reconstruction, complementing traditional archaeological and textual methods. Environmental and climate archaeology studies have added a new dimension to understanding the Hittite Empire's rise and fall. Sediment cores, pollen analysis, and isotopic data provide evidence of drought periods, fluctuating river flows, and soil degradation, which corroborate textual references to famine and agricultural strain. Such interdisciplinary research situates the empire within broader ecological dynamics, illustrating how environmental stress intersected with political and economic systems. By linking climate data with archaeological layers of destruction and abandonment, scholars can better explain periods of crisis, such as the Late Bronze Age collapse, in systemic terms. Ongoing research has also generated debates about ethnic identity, language, and Indo-European migration. While Hittite is the earliest attested Indo-European language, questions remain regarding the relationship between Hittite speakers and the indigenous Hattians, as well as the timing and nature of Anatolian settlement. Scholars examine material culture, burial practices, and linguistic diffusion to assess whether the Hittite state arose primarily through migration, elite dominance, or syncretic integration of multiple populations. These debates have implications for understanding the mechanisms of cultural transmission, state formation, and the dynamics of early Indo-European dispersal. Furthermore, digital and comparative studies continue to refine interpretations of Hittite political structures. Analysis of royal annals, treaties, and administrative texts challenges earlier assumptions of rigid hierarchy, suggesting instead a flexible and adaptive governance model. Evidence of regional autonomy, vassal negotiation, and administrative pragmatism highlights how the empire balanced centralized authority with local control, insights that reshape conventional narratives of imperial overreach. From myth to evidence, the Hittite story now rests on firm ground. The Hittites vanished, but their tablets preserved the logic of civilization itself. From the earliest Indo-European migrations into Anatolia to the emergence of Hattusa as a political and religious center, the Hittite trajectory exemplifies the processes of state formation in the Bronze Age. Their rise demonstrates how military innovation, bureaucratic sophistication, and diplomatic acumen coalesce to produce an empire capable of controlling diverse territories and populations across Anatolia and northern Syria. Conquests under rulers such as Hattusili I, Mursili I, and Suppiluliuma I reflect not only martial prowess but also strategic integration of administration, religion, and law, enabling a degree of cohesion unprecedented in the region at the time. The subsequent centuries of fragmentation and recovery reveal the vulnerability of such polities to internal succession crises, overextension, and environmental stress. Reformers like Telepainu codified succession and restored order, illustrating how legal and bureaucratic structures could stabilize societies even after periods of intense turmoil. By the time of the Great Kingdom, Under rulers including Mursalai II and Tidhalia IV, the empire had achieved an apex in both territorial reach and institutional complexity, balancing military might with intricate diplomacy and religious legitimacy. The Late Bronze Age collapse underscores the limitations of even the most sophisticated systems when faced with simultaneous pressures: climate stress, trade disruptions, and the movement of peoples. Yet the Hittites' cultural and institutional legacy persisted. Neo-Hittite successor states carried forward language, religion, and administrative practices, bridging the Bronze and Iron Ages and influencing the trajectory of Anatolian history. Their enduring presence in the northern Levant demonstrates that imperial collapse need not entail cultural extinction. Modern archaeology and philology have completed the narrative arc, transforming the Hittites from a vaguely remembered civilization into a fully documented historical actor. Excavations at Hattusa, Kasakli, and Kyalipinar, combined with the decipherment of cuneiform and Loian hieroglyphs, allow scholars to reconstruct political, economic, and religious systems in fine detail. Interdisciplinary approaches integrating climate data, settlement patterns, and textual analysis provide a holistic understanding of how the Hittite Empire functioned, adapted, and ultimately declined. Comparative study situates Hutti within the broader Near Eastern world. Its legal codes, diplomatic treaties, and polytheistic religion show both continuity with Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions and innovative responses to the particular challenges of Anatolia. Hittite civilization thus offers crucial insights into the dynamics of early empires, the interplay of environment, economy, warfare, and ideology, as well as the mechanisms through which authority is negotiated and maintained across complex societies. Thank you for joining this journey through the rise, governance, and enduring legacy of the Hittites. If you found this exploration insightful, subscribe for more in-depth historical documentaries and enable notifications to follow the unfolding stories of ancient civilizations. For those who wish to dive deeper, links to academic sources, excavation reports, and related episodes are available in the description. Settle in, explore, and continue uncovering the layers of history that shaped our world.